as testing my own understanding of it as well. As I said, well, let's go back and look and see where did this all come from.
Good afternoon, guys.
Hi. How you doing, Joseph?
Good. Thanks for hosting this.
Yes, David rocks. That's you, David. You rock.
Yeah. I can post that in the comments. No.
Allow me. For the record.
Yeah.
David, in fact, rocks. There we go.
There we go.
Let there be no confusion.
Exactly.
Now, have I ever shared my desktop using Zoom? I don't know if I ever have. I'm not sure how to do that. Oh, share screen. Da-da. Okay, duh.
Well, if you're sharing screen,
well, not yet.
My idea is I have to do that.
You did a thing? What did you do? David says it's a secret. Shh. Hi, Dave. Welcome to the call.
Guys, how you doing?
Good. Pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, you too. You too. This was a fascinating reading this week. It was awesome.
He's getting into it.
I'm a little behind on the reading aspect of it, but
oh, that's okay. We're going to slow down. We've in the past weeks been just like tearing through an entire essay per session, but this one's got too much to it. We're gonna slow down and pull it apart and see what he's actually saying here.
Cool.
It'll be more textually driven.
Do a sentence by sentence exegesis.
I mean, sometimes we can breeze through parts of it, and other parts we may, in fact, get stuck on a sentence for a half hour. And go, well, let's see. This alludes to 17 different things.
What were some of the quotes in italics? Was it like an email exchange or a letter exchange?
Yes. So Kenneth was really active on an email list that he started from, I don't know, 2000-ish until 2014-ish. And it still exists, but he's not nearly as active on it now as he was. And it was a place where he could write responses to news articles that came out, or where people could throw questions at him, where he could throw out essays that he was working on. And so it was just a philosophical ferment kind of area. And it's helpful, I think, to see these not as much in abstracto, but really the way that they appeared. What got him started talking about these things. One of his premises as a teacher is that, it was fine to have a curriculum and have laid out your pedagogy, but it was even better to let people bring up the things that they were curious about or concerned about, or that they objected to. And then he could adapt the class on the fly. Because as he said, there's almost no sentence a human being can say that doesn't give part of themselves away and show some of what they're wrestling with inside. Once you're attuned to what are the main kinds of things people struggle with, you can see people's assumptions that even they don't see. They can ask what they think is a straightforward factual question, and in fact, they're revealing they're a Neoplatonist without realizing it. And that's when he can say, well, let's see what Plato would have to say. But then what would Aristotle say in reply to Plato? And so forth. So he did that with that list. It's like anything is grist for the mill.
I loved his Kierkegaard quotes in this one. We understand life backwards, but it has to be lived forwards. That's
yes. You can see on the one hand the way in which Kierkegaard was a Hegelian out of things like that, and on the other you can see how Hegel was not lying when he said that there wasn't a single proposition of Heraclitus's that he didn't make a central part of Hegelian philosophy, because the love of paradox and showing how, from a mortal perspective, many things that are true actually appear paradoxical,
right,
to us.
It's so interesting. We were talking about this all in week 1 and 2, and then here it is in week 4. We had yin and yang after this, like week 1 or 2, and now
Yeah.
here he is. And it's just interesting. I never knew Heraclitus explored paradox so thoroughly. I guess from what I understand, he maybe wrote one book, and we don't really know much about him. It's just a fascinating guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Paradox was his stock in trade. He, you know, Kenneth Smith has an unusual position on Heraclitus. He says the more you study Heraclitus, the less clear it is there was ever a book. It might just have been a scroll full of these things, full of aphorisms. Maybe the reason people don't quote extended passages is there weren't any.
It almost sounds like a regurgitation of some like Eastern. I mean, I wonder if there's like a Buddha quality in that, and all this stuff gets so distorted over time. I just wonder if that Heraclitus is more of a system of thought, that Eastern way of fusing, yin and yang together, and if it was even a man.
Yeah. Well, it does seem to be a guy. We know a certain amount about him, but you're right. There's been some very interesting books written exploring whether or not there was contact between the tradition that led to Heraclitus on the one hand and the tradition that led to Buddha or Taoism on the other. And entire books could be written because actually there was the Silk Road. There was a tremendous amount of traffic between partially because of Persia, partially because of India, leading all the way to China. So back and forth, we like to say over and over how long ago people were primitive and didn't move away from their homes ever. But actually, when we say that, we're describing the Dark Ages of Europe. We're not describing all time and all place in the world. And many people traveled all over the place. There was a lot of exchange over a huge range. So you sort of, like you say, you start to notice the kind of parallels between Lao Tzu and Taoism and Heraclitus and in his Heracliteanism. So yeah, I think the position that there might not have been a book, just a scroll made up of these little wisdom fragments is unique. I've never heard anybody say that except Kenneth Smith. And it's possible. It's possible. We know it was in scroll form because Aristotle made a reference to reading that scroll at the temple of Artemis in Ephesus. One of the wonders of the world was where he deposited his scroll.
It's interesting. His story sort of echoes those other. I mean, like, there's nothing directly attributable to the Buddha, for example, at all. I think, wasn't it Confucius? There's nothing directly attributable, or maybe Sophocles, one or the other. I think Confucius. They say that it may not have existed. It just sort of has a parallel to all those types of schools of thought. I wonder if there's something there.
Yeah. Lao Tzu.
Socrates too.
Socrates,
right?
yes, exactly. Socrates.
Right. Everything from Socrates comes from somebody else.
Right.
Though I heard that Heraclitus wrote a lot, but it's just that we don't have any of that stuff because whatever, the great library was burned down or whatever. And the only thing we have is other people that have mentioned fragments of his thought.
Yeah. It's true that we get all of his stuff from other people quoting it. But, interestingly, a very strong personality comes through these quotes. And a lot of it is stuff that the people quoting them would never have said themselves. They clearly are quoting somebody else because the intent is so radically different. And you can see that not just when they're quoting, what do I want to say? How does it appear? It appears, you sort of see this, not just when they understand it, whether they agree or disagree, but you also see it when they're quoting it and they clearly didn't understand it. You can see them critiquing a line of Heraclitus, either they're in favor of it or they're against it from their distinctive perspective. But when you actually read the line they're quoting, you realize they didn't read enough Heraclitus to understand what he meant there, because if you've read other Heraclitus, you can see that he might actually have meant the opposite of what the person thinks that he's saying. And so the voice is that strong that even when someone doesn't understand the voice and is passing it along, it still comes through, which is one of the characteristics of real people, of distinctive people.
And it's myth, can't step in the same spot in the river twice. That's like a myth,
Very
it's a mythic thought.
Very mythic. Yeah. Yeah, it was Nietzsche who really drew a hard line between everybody who came before Socrates and then Socrates and everybody who came afterwards, and said that with Socrates, Plato, and the Sophists, you see the rise of this logos culture that has a very different approach to thinking about the world, thinking about human nature, and so forth. And what you see in Heraclitus is a survival of the pre-logos mode of Greek culture. I mean,
I
he's
heard this. Sorry,
go
I
ahead.
heard this one about Nietzsche, that he said that the Greeks, like the Heraclitus, those people, that their take on the world was one of gratitude, and that with the Socrates and the Platonics, set the stage for Christianity, where the basis was fear.
Um,
Certainly criticism, at least. The logos culture idea is that, well, Socrates just said it, right? The unexamined life is not worth living for a person. He just blurted it out. So his idea was that there shouldn't be an unconscious. You should consciously evaluate everything, and only good things would result. Right? This is part of the Socratic method, is the idea of if you could just bring everything to consciousness, then that would help make bad things better. And that is a very Apollonian perspective, and it's one of the things that Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Smith and others criticize and say we've taken it for granted for too long. It's important to examine your life. It's important to examine your thoughts and how you work. But at the same time, the idea that the result can only be good is actually a toxic idea, because life's too short. We aren't around long enough. And it's very easy, if you get too into this, to rip apart the basic ethical foundations of how we should treat each other in the world and conclude that why don't we have death camps and strip mine everything? Why not? You can come up with an idea that makes it seem reasonable, and then you follow through on it, because you've ungrounded yourself from the survivability of your species, which is not something that we decided on. It's something we inherited. We were born into the species that had evolved this far. We don't understand how we got here or what the things are that are necessary for our survival. And if we start saying, well, let's throw all of that out and only stick to the things that we've rationally decided upon, then we have the baby with the bathwater problem. And the baby that we're throwing out could be whether it's possible to even have a sustainable human culture, for the long run.
but isn't it the pursuit of virtue that should actually supersede that? Therefore, you wouldn't have death camps in those types of circumstances. So the idea that if you're pursuing justice, well then yes, what does justice mean underneath that? We can make up what we want, and and I can see where Kierkegaard comes in with his Hegelian approach. But I think that if you're pursuing what is truly just, that you wouldn't have those things. Am I thinking about that incorrectly?
Well, that you put your finger right on the issue. I mean, that's what we need to do, but the challenge is what's truly just.
Right.
And
Right. What's truth?
If we start by saying, let's continue as we have been continuing, but selectively critique the things that look wrong to us, then what happens then is you sort of get this momentum of the things that were working for hundreds of thousands of years that allowed us to be here, don't get messed with too radically. We pick at the things that clearly aren't working and move those, but we sort of, even when we don't understand, we still inherit and carry along the things that were working. But if we say, let's throw everything out and start over, then suddenly we've given ourselves a responsibility we may not be able to rise up to,
Right.
which is now we have to be able to specify all this stuff we didn't even know about and that we don't even understand.
Right. It becomes complete chaos within that structure. So then the idea, is this where the idea of myth comes in?
Yeah.
And then what is true within that? And so how that factors into, what is order and what is chaos within that structure. And
I was just going to say, even the idea of justice, if we're only approaching that from a logos mindset, then that will necessarily be incomplete, according to Ken Smith. So that's where myth comes in as the necessary counterweight to the atomizing force of science and logos. Myth is a more unified, immersive, yin-like perspective, and you can't have a concept of justice without that myth counterweight. And he even says we've gone so far that we may have lost our way, that we're not even able to appreciate normal logos culture, that we're in a hyper logos culture right now. I think that's where I really, I think that's where Ken Smith is just so astute, and for me almost scintillating in his critique of modern culture. He's able to do it in a way that I've never really seen done before.
Yeah.
And it's unbelievable.
Yeah, that he's able to talk about, he's able to draw off of Heraclitus and Hegel and Kierkegaard and others and show how we have to have a rational mind. We have to explore it. We have to examine things. But at the same time, we can't do it from the posture that let's begin with a blank page.
Right.
Because to say that we're competent to begin with the blank page is to ascribe deific-like characteristics to human reason, right? It's to say that we know everything, so we know what should be on the page.
No,
I think it's too, like when you bring up justice, you know, what that brings up is also culture, but also like herd mentality, and sort of like, is justice about making everything good and even for people, where Nietzsche kind of, you know, goes against that and says that, you know, we don't want that, that's not the way things work, you know, that it's the individual more than the culture, you know? And so I think that, you know, justice, you know, can also be kind of entangled, at least, you know, with the idea of a herd mentality, you know, the lowest common denominator kind of, this is what we'll do.
Yeah, this is where we're really going to get into the juicy, chewy parts of this essay over the next few weeks. There are some very complicated issues here that I'm hoping that together we can actually simplify, get into drawing form, get into schematic paper form to help us to find our way through. So Nietzsche in particular is very hard to read correctly. He's easy to misread. I mean, really easy to misread, but he's very hard to read correctly because he doesn't always signal when he turns left, if you know what I mean. He's constantly hopping back and forth between questions of what is natural to us versus what do we choose for ourselves, and then what is good and what is not good, and what does the crowd do and what do individuals do. And he doesn't say, now let's turn and look at this from another angle. He just mid-sentence will swerve into the other perspective, and if you don't know that he's done that, then the sentence you just read could seem to mean almost the opposite of what he meant by it.
Oh, wow.
And he really doesn't care whether you understand him or not. He's just, it's part of what makes him so challenging is he's not writing like a teacher, right? He's writing like he's writing a journal, and he's all revved up about what he's saying, but he's expressing it in his own language and his own swerves. So what he thinks about the crowd, what he thinks about nature, is it individualist versus a group? You'll see that in things like he has contempt for the way that the crowd is artificial and weakens itself and doesn't do the right thing, tries to do the thing that will reward it and allow it to get along in its society, even if the society is doing the wrong things. Right. So we've mentioned in previous weeks, he was a critic of the rise of German nationalism, the kind of mindless, go Germany, German's the best. Our religion is the best, our language is the best, our philosophy is the best. He hated that stuff. And so when he talks about the need to rise and do better, it could easily, out of context, be misread as meaning the exact opposite of what he meant. It could be read as meaning that he was in favor of Germany, saying that they're trying to be better than everybody else.
That's what his sister did, right?
That's what his sister did.
Yeah, so that's how they...
So it makes him a tough read. But if we put him in context with Kierkegaard and Arendt and Smith and Hegel and the other Hegelians to sort of see what he's drawing off of, and especially with the Greeks to see what he's drawing off of, it becomes a little easier to map out his swerves and figure out when he's doing that. So that's why we're slowing down starting this week, and we're gonna take this essay piece by piece and work our way through it. I want to build some extra material around this essay, and we could do it together as you guys have questions or comments and concerns until we sort of have a roadmap to help us kind of see the system.
Good.
It's not a simple system.
No.
And part of the reason that it's not simple is it's not an artificial system. He's attempting to describe what naturally is going on. And because he's not inventing it from scratch, but instead is sort of drawing off of what have all these other really insightful philosophers said on these subjects, and how do their terminology and schemas relate to each other? And if we put all that together, then what kind of schema would we come up with to talk about those same issues? So
it makes, I'm sorry,
go ahead.
it makes me think, again, about justice, that
Yeah.
it's like justice, but you have to look at it, and then you have to say morality.
Yes.
And you have to say morality, right, wrong. It's a splitting kind of thing.
Yes.
And I think like the one thing that psychoanalysis brings is the idea of ambivalence, that it's not splitting of good, bad, but it's like having them both there in the process. And though I think he does it much more radically, and proposes that what we say is the bad actually is the good. I think he leans more on that side as being like that's the vitality, that's the power.
Nietzsche.
Yeah, Nietzsche. Sorry.
Yeah.
I always, because Kenneth Smith just seems like Nietzsche, to me.
He's certainly got flavors. The more you read the different philosophers that Smith's drawn off of, the more you start to see them in his work. But you also see that he never takes them raw. He always digests them and incorporates them into the rest of it. So, he'll on the one hand tell you, here's how the world looks according to Kierkegaard, and we're going to talk about that some today. But then he'll turn around and say, but here's what Kierkegaard got wrong. If you describe it in terms of Hegel and Nietzsche and Arendt and others, you can see that Kierkegaard got so many things right, but he missed this piece. Here's why he missed it. And if we're going to go forward, we have to incorporate that. So we're going to go through some of that today.
Why don't you give us a little dollop of that?
All right. Well, let's go. Oh, go ahead. Someone else.
Hey, Rick, I was wondering, I'm starting to kind of get into kind of the classic continental thinkers more in detail. Could you briefly give us your take on say Kant and kind of falling within kind of like logos, mythos thinking, kind of that divide, and then kind of Nietzsche, like I was reading, like he was initially influenced by Kant naturally, I think, but then later had replies and disagreements with Kant's thinking. I don't know if that's sort of something you can, in a nutshell, give a kind of a brief thought.
Yeah, sure. So Kant is an ultra Apollonian. The Critique of Pure Reason pretty much says right off the bat what his topic matter is. He's going to talk about logical abstractive reasoning. And in doing so, he's drawing off the Neoplatonic tradition. Parmenides to Socrates to Plato, filtered a bit through Aristotle, although Aristotle wasn't a true Platonist. He was a critic of Plato as well. And then that got incorporated into the structure of the medieval Catholic Church. The flavor of Christianity that became the norm for Europe took on this strong Neoplatonist flavor, very focused on logic and reason, abstract ways of deducing what the truth is. So when we get into the Renaissance and the breakthroughs starting 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, you start to see these philosophers emerge who are attempting to comb and separate out medieval scholasticism from more serious Greek formal logic. They're trying to go back to Aristotle. They're trying to say what was distorted over the last 1,000 years. How would we get closer to what that tradition of reasoning was? And you see that in Kant. There's a line that goes from Plato through Aristotle through some other people to Kant in his attempt to say here's proper reasoning. This is what proper reasoning looks like. Now, that tradition was in opposition to the Hegelian tradition. And the Hegelian tradition goes back to Heraclitus. Certainly Hegel read Kant and incorporated Kant. Everything Kant has to say is part of the larger Hegelian system. But Hegel was a critic of Kant. I can't remember if this is the essay where he says it. He says Hegel compared Kant to a medieval peasant who wanted to understand how to swim before he would ever get in the water. He didn't want to be immersed in the experience of life until after he understood it. And the way that he structures, the way that Kant structures his books, you can see that. He's like, let's set out to describe what proper reasoning would be, and then we will reason that way. And Hegel and Kierkegaard and Smith are saying, you're already reasoning before you start doing that, and you're not taking into account the fatedness and naturalness of the situation that you've inherited. Your reasoning isn't as pure as you think it is. You've just cleaned it up so that it's harder to see the unconscious things that are driving you, that you now have sort of put under the fig leaf of reason. And so you think that you're doing something that's different from what you're actually doing. This was Heraclitus's critique of Parmenides. It was part of when Aristotle was attempting to critique Plato. He brought that same issue in. Actually, Diogenes, when he famously throws the plucked chicken on the table and says, there's Plato's man, because Plato said that man is a featherless biped, right? And he's like, well, here's a featherless biped. I guess that's a man. And what he's going after is he's saying, you're artificially attempting to create categories that aren't actually present in the natural world. And then you're trying to reason with those. And the results that you're going to come to are going to be artificial and distorted as a result. That whole thing, sort of taking that for granted and not fully coming to grips with the fatedness, the unconsciousness, the naturalness that infuses everything that we try to reason, that's in Kant. You can see him trying to reason perfectly and purely and stringently, and it's good that somebody explored that. It needed to be explored, but it also needs to be critiqued and brought into the larger picture of human reasoning. So that I don't know if that, but Richard, that's kind of where Kant kind of relates to Hegel and to this other work.
Okay. And Nietzsche's response to Kant?
So when you first get into philosophy, it's almost impossible not to fall in love with Socrates. I mean, here's a man who seems to have died for philosophy. He's like, he's like a culture hero. The first version of Socrates we all get is, oh my God, that's commitment to the truth. I want to die for the truth. How many teenage wannabe philosophers, had Socrates as their hero for that very reason. And it takes a while to work out that Socrates wasn't actually all philosophy for all time. He wasn't actually, an all-encompassing philosopher. He was more in the Parmenidean, Platonic, Kantian line than is initially apparent. There's a lot of things about the way that he did philosophy that turn out to be ultra-Apollonian. They're very clever. They're very, you can empathize with it. You can empathize with him. He's an interesting character. There's all this stuff, but it's like only half the picture being presented as though it's the full picture. And one of the ways that you can see that is in the criticisms that Athens directed towards him, what they were accusing him of. It wasn't just that he didn't honor the gods, although we always quote that. We quote that because it sounds irrational. So we're like, see those irrational people, they killed Socrates. And certainly Plato felt that way about it. But they also said he corrupted the morals of the youth. And what they meant was the rise of sophistry. A whole generation of people who were educated enough to be able to teach you how to argue the wrong case as though it were the right case, who could present injustice as though it were justice, which they openly bragged of doing. Like sophists marketed their skills in the agora. They would go out there and say, I can teach you how to win an argument even when you're wrong. They were proud of it. Well, they learned that from Socrates and from the school that he came from. And that ability to warp reality and use reason to turn things inside out helped to generate a new generation of Athenian politicians who likewise went after what was profitable to them, but made it look like it was virtuous for the Greeks. And so the thing where Athens began to take more and more of the money from the states that were supposed to be supporting it to help fight against Persia and other enemies, but instead of using it for the defense of Greece, what they were actually doing was glorifying Athens and putting up more statues and making themselves richer. And there was this whole warpage away from justice and away from reason, but presented as justice and as reason, that the Athenians were like, you're killing us. Our whole society is falling apart, and you're the one who taught the kids how to do this because you said you don't need to honor the gods. You just need to honor what your own daemon tells you.
Interesting.
That never gets talked about. When we're idolizing Socrates, we don't talk about that side of it. And that's because most of our exposure to Socrates comes from Plato, who worshipped him. Right? So we don't see the whole Socrates. We see the Platonic ideal of Socrates. But if you read Xenophon, or is it Xenophanes? I always get the two mixed up, and they're totally different guys. One of them wrote his own account of the trial of Socrates. And he's the one that says, here's what the full set of criticisms was. Here's what they were going after him for. So weaponized language. Yeah, Dave, that's right. Weaponized language, weaponized reason. You know, it's the moment you take these tools and unhook them from their proper context, they become like an invasive species. And so he talks about logos culture, logos as a set of capabilities within human beings when it is leashed to nature and to sustainability and justice is a blessing when it's a servant. But if it's unleashed from those things and you start with a tabula rasa and you just start thinking and deciding that whatever you're thinking must be true because you did it validly, that's when it becomes toxic. And that's what, you know, a money-based economy in which there are no other values, only money, becomes dangerous, or a law-based economy. You know, we wanted to make a civilization of laws, not men. That was one of the explicit founding goals of the founding fathers of this country. But of course, the moment you do that, you've unhooked it from human nature, and now the laws can become inhumane and unrealistic. Right. So all of this is ultra Apollonianism, and it all traces back there. So that's one of the subtexts. And, you know, when you say, Dave, it's scintillating, you know, part of what's interesting about this is that you don't get to hear this kind of criticism of modernism very much. Normally, when people criticize the modern order, they do so in very limited ways. Like they'll say, well, it's unfair, or we don't like what we did to this species, or slavery was bad. And it's true, these things were huge and awful. But what Smith is showing is that it's part of a much larger picture. It's like a whole mindset that naturally produces a desire to enslave people or to commit genocide or to wipe out entire species because it has its ideas and it thinks that nothing should restrain it from exercising its will according to those ideas, that it's not fated, that it's not bound by nature, that it shouldn't have natural limits. You should just be able to exercise your will to the greatest of your ability. Ultimately, might makes right in an intellectualized form. And it's going to just naturally keep producing these kinds of atrocities and disasters as an inevitable, natural, fated part of the structure of the way that it sees the world and values things or doesn't value things. This is where you just see this sort of amazing inversion of everything we've been taught in school. Why did the Holocaust happen? Well, because some bad, crazy people, they weren't rational enough. They were prejudiced, right? And prejudice is an artificial emotionalist thing. And so what we really need to do is educate people more and teach them to be more rational. And Smith says, oh yeah? Well, what was the most rational scientific country in the world? It was Germany, right? It's like we don't want to admit that unleashed from justice and nature, that reason can be an advocate of genocide. You could rationally, logically deduce that I think I should enslave an entire continent of people because look how rich I'll get, right? If money is the value and you have to logically, rigorously follow the logic, then you must enslave people. It comes right out.
So I could see how this links into maybe economic systems then.
Yes.
And how this drives our economic systems, and even the idea that it's functioning around rational actors.
Yes.
And that with this type of rational behavior, then you understand that why people's motives are what they are. Yes. And why they can actually rationalize anything as a means to an end within that framework.
And particularly Malthusian economics, which Ken Smith he calls, I loved this turn of phrase, Malthusian Americans.
Yes.
And talking about how we prefer junk food and entertainment and killing time, and that we outsource our creativity and we look to others to be creative for us.
Yes.
Without even realizing the inherent deficiency to that approach to life. It could never satisfy us. Yes. And yet we do that anyway. I loved that. So particularly the Malthusian part of that, Joseph.
Someone who isn't too...
Go ahead, Dowdy.
Sorry. As someone who isn't too versed in economics, could you give a quick explanation of Malthus and sort of how, like, what Malthusian economics means?
You want to do it, Rick, or you want?
No, take it, Dave. You got it.
I would just say briefly, you know, he's a guy that was in the 1700s writing about, oh my God, there's going to be too many people on Earth. We don't have the capability to sustain them in terms of land or food. And working with what he saw at that time, which was no technology, no global trade, none of what we sort of take for granted today. It was a very logical conclusion. And I think it was promoted by the elite because it leads to a hyper competitive aspect where if there's only going to be food for so many people, then we have to fight over it.
Right.
And we should dominate the food supply. We should stockpile food, even if we don't need it. It leads to all these hyper competitive aspects. And so this has really been promulgated, and you see these myths of overpopulation continue even today, and they're used to really justify absolute atrocities, or if not atrocities, simply viewing people as objects instead of human beings. It leads to this type of a mentality where you're just making calculations. Okay, there's a virus, so many people are going to die, let's just chalk it up to that and we'll get to herd immunity as fast as possible. It leads to this type of valueless, moral free type of thinking, which is why I think Ken Smith's critique is so appropriate, because we have to interject morality back into this discussion. And in the Malthusian trap, it's called, you can justify a lack of morality, it becomes rational. So just that idea of overpopulation, it's a complete myth, by the way. We have plenty of food. We could feed up to 10 billion people with our current food. 30% of food goes directly into a landfill. So this is totally detached from reality. And yet you still hear people today argue passionately about overpopulation. It's some kind of problem. We have to do something about it. We shouldn't have kids, etc.
Yeah, you see pushback against this Malthusian perspective in Indigenous American societies. There's a lot of Native Americans are very clear on the fact that when white people talk about there ought to be fewer people, they mean fewer brown people, right? They're like, no. Also, they're keenly aware of the difference between the haves and the have-nots in a way that the average American isn't, because poverty is so extreme on reservations. So they can see the inequitable distribution of resources, and to them, the 30% waste, and that's not even all the food is waste, it's just what, as you say, goes directly to a landfill. They can see the devastating effects of that more clearly than somebody who doesn't really go hungry very often, who therefore doesn't have to think about it. There's all kinds of issues of privilege and marginalization. What can a privileged person not see because it's not part of their life? So I've been an environmentalist my whole life, but you can see this Malthusian kind of delusion all over the place in the environmentalist movement. Constantly, people are saying the reason the Earth is in such trouble is because there's too many people. Even when there's studies that show that half of all the carbon emitted into the atmosphere comes from only 17 corporations.
Wow.
Right? Only 17. It's like, it's not everybody, right? There's massively uneven distribution of the damage being done to the world. And, if you think, what would happen if we were to apply our ingenuity to farming in less wasteful ways, doing industry in less wasteful ways, and polluting less, and in being smarter about where we put our housing and farms so that we protect natural areas that have more endemic species where they really need that particular piece of land. We could massively reduce the negative impact we're having on the world without decreasing the number of people one iota. I mean, we could revolutionize our impact on the world. But this Malthusian, ideology is so tempting. It's so easy to slip into because everything else about the way we live sort of unconsciously drives us into competition against each other.
And I think Ken Smith even puts his finger on why this Malthusian myth stays with us for so long. And I think this is so relevant. I mean, I wrote it down. He said, it's a fraud, and he's not just talking about this Malthusian mindset. He's talking about, all of these misconceptions that a hyper logos culture has, that they are a fraud meant to serve the interests and logic of the regime of capital, not the authentic or natural psychic needs of life. I feel that is so appropriate, that criticism. Many things are just frauds designed to serve the interests of capital and have nothing to do with real life.
It's what's interesting about modernism that we don't like to admit to very often because it's uncomfortable. But you look at Athens during the Golden Age, and the economy was part of the culture. It was supposed to serve the culture. but it was only part of it. Money, many things couldn't be bought for money. Most things that mattered couldn't be bought for money. You couldn't, you couldn't buy prestige. You couldn't buy honor. There's all kinds of stuff you couldn't buy. Money was like an assist, for when you needed to do certain kinds of exchange. But in the modern world, not only can you exchange anything for money, literally everything has a price, but every other part of the civilization, even the religions, are turned into adjuncts of the market. They're all expected to be profitable. They're all even the nonprofits, if you look at the structure of the law defining nonprofits in the US, it's all about the money and how it flows. Right? Not about this exists in order to do good.
Exactly. Exactly.
Like, where do the excess profits go? If it goes this way, then you're a nonprofit. It's like, exactly. Oh my God.
No, I mean, nonprofits sometimes are the most profitable. And it's it's interesting. And you're talking about resources, and I don't want to go too far off of topic, but the idea of something like, you brought up the 17 corporations accounting for, most of the carbon emissions, and you think of things even like water. Only 8% of the population, individuals, actually use water, and the rest is used by corporations. So that if we have a water crisis, so to speak, then we're actually misallocating and like misdirecting on how, like, we can solve that problem very easily. But we have this, like, as you explained, this Malthusian economic approach that actually that it disincentivize that kind of saving or practical thinking.
Yeah,
I know I'm doing a lot of talking. I just want to briefly point out that water futures just started trading this week on the CME.
More than gold.
This is just, and I think Ken Smith has given me a vocabulary to talk about this now. This is just the hyper logos culture trying to solve this problem using a hyper logical means, and that's why it's destined to fail.
Right.
This is why we know intuitively water futures are not going to bring water to people who are starving in Africa or anywhere.
It's going to take it away from them.
Exactly. So this is just hyper logical culture trapped in itself, which Ken Smith describes as being pathological.
Well, what is more likely is going to happen is basically just create these, these bets of, party counterparties. And then, like, when the economy blows up again, then it creates like impetus for them to go try to get bailed out.
Right. Yeah. That's a whole nother level of this thing that happens with the market where, the poor are expected to compete. The rich sort of pretend to compete, except whenever they need to get bailed out, they go for, socialism. They have the government save them and then leave all of the employees and everybody else to continue to struggle. And so you see this, for example, with, the way Nestle has been buying up water sources all over the world, right? Or even when they're not buying it, they're landing these sweetheart deals so that even during the drought in California, Nestle was still overpumping all the aquifers and lowering the levels in California at a time when they needed that water for other things. But you're not allowed to question Nestle's profits. You can question whether people deserve to survive, out of control fires in California. Maybe it's just a tragedy and they should just die. But Nestle can't. It would be criminal. It would be wrong, morally wrong for Nestle not to have access to the water it needs to profit. That stuck through while other things were sacrificed. And it shows us what our priorities are.
And imagine
and corporations are people. That's sort of the morality.
Yeah. And imagine if we thought about water not as a commodity, but as a god or a goddess.
Right.
Would we be able to list a future and trade it and buy and sell it? This is where myth is so important. I mean, he's really put his finger on, I think, what we need to appreciate. This may be one of the best books I've ever read so far, I have to say.
Wow, thanks.
Yeah, the myths are our values, right? So that, the idea that you're, what the gods were. And then, we started to consolidate the gods as we started to engage with more things that we didn't actually know, or that we would get to know. So it's a way of like engaging with the unknown myth.
Right.
And so and in this way, like, yes, this is where mythology actually is powerful in shaping our social systems. Because, if we don't know it, then we'll explain it through our myths, and then that drives our systems themselves.
I think it's
Go ahead,
kind of
Richard.
like ironic that like we kind of maybe like look down on the ancients a bit because like if there's like some sort of natural disaster or drought or crop failure, then they'll say like, oh, the gods are angry and kind of attribute this motivation to them. But then like every day we're basically watching like whether our god is angry, and our god is the stock market slash economy. It's like, and then we attribute like this eternal magical wisdom to like whether the Dow's gone up 1,000 points a day or whatever, or vice versa. And sort of kind of like it's kind of interesting, like just when you kind of look at marketing, kind of unpacking the messages like of and kind of different classes of people within our society and our economy, like it's like sort of like the mindset of those with capital is that your money is working for you even when you're not working, right? But then if you're a worker, you have the complete opposite problem where you're not paid, like the people like with like that are really calling all the shots, and like you're just empowered, like it's you're not paid even when you're working, kind of like where the obvious things are, companies like smaller companies that have basically cheated their workers like on their timesheets, or basically this gig economy where kind of like Uber, like now it's like it's being applied to like people who answer calls and customer service agents. Is that you're sitting at the desk, you've paid all this money to buy all the computer system set up, and you're paid for all the training, so you can now be an independent contractor and provide service to be a customer service representative. And you're sitting there, but you're not paid until you actually get a call. And then at any kind of any moment, like if you get a bad rating or whatever, 1 or 2, then you can basically get terminated, with little recourse.
And how about the idea of just tying your inherent worth to how much you make? I mean, how ridiculous is that? And yet happens all the time and is glorified in our culture. We'd rather hear what a billionaire has to say as opposed to, I can't even come up with a counterexample because I'm so trapped in hyper logos culture.
Yes.
In our culture, like, we have, the superhero movies, but like outside of that fantasy world, like, which still, is relevant, even though it's not real. I mean, but our superheroes and our demigods are our CEOs and like, like central bankers and like Federal Reserve chairman, people, those, and, like, quote, the masters of the universe, right? Like they are, it's like.
So is that our belief system now? Essentially, that's essentially what our belief system is, and that these myths that we're creating now, these myths that
it's an anti-myth,
it's an anti-myth. It really is, because
I remember they had Alan Greenspan, when he was the head of the whatever it is, he was like, to Congress saying, how he had kept the economy roaring was that he had trapped all the people in their jobs because they had to stay there for health care.
Yeah.
So he's bragging to the political system that, I've kept, them in slavery. They can't move. And so we can kind of keep it as a constant and kind of manipulate it in our way. It's just it's just a horror show.
Well, the perverse thing is it's not constant. It's gotten worse and worse and worse and worse. Like getting healthcare with a job or trying to find that is few and far between. And even people who have healthcare through their jobs, in some cases, like if you're like a low paid worker, you can't afford to pay those premiums. But even like getting into the middle class, like you have the healthcare plan, but you can't afford, the copays and stuff and the out-of-pocket maximums.
Yeah.
Because this logos culture needs to extract more and more and more capital.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's also interesting about, like, this is a slightly different thing about slavery. Like the system enslaves all the kind of creative people, the people that actually have intellect and stuff, and they're just kind of enslaved into these entertainment, the creatives, they're just, trapped into kind of doing creative things that are entertainment. And it's just a siphoning off of all this, like, kind of genius of the humanity, into this weird little thing. We've enslaved the people that actually could do something into, these manipulative little jobs because, I'm an artist, so I better be a graphic designer because it's the only thing I can make any money at or something.
Right. So with that as sort of an introduction, why don't we take this and turn to the text? And what we're going to find is the stuff we're talking about is just, it's there. It's constantly being brought in.
Cool.
And this is a different approach. I mean, I haven't done this approach in previous weeks on these calls, but I think this one really calls for it. There's too many references to things. He's pulling in too many philosophers and too many ideas, and we really need to unpack it. This is, I think one of the first weeks that we did these, I talked about the way that, part of what's fascinating about serious philosophers is that what they're writing is it's a form of poetry in which it's extraordinarily dense with meaning, and you can't read it the way you read, a fiction book or a newspaper, because if you do, you'll miss almost everything that they're saying. And part of the reason why the language is difficult is if we are attempting to read a sentence of Kenneth Smith the way that we read a newspaper opening sentence, then our pacing is wrong. So we're expecting a low density of information, which means we should be able to just fly through the sentence and get onto the second one. And at first, we think the reason that we slow down is because he's bad. He doesn't know how to write clearly. But once we start to get the references, we can see that it's that we're reading it badly, that we need to adjust the pace of our reading to the density of the information. And it's true from one Kenneth Smith writing to another. Some of them you can read more quickly than others. But some of them, like this one, there's just a lot going on, and slowing down makes it easier to absorb.
It shows too that that's what the culture does. It sets up a system where you can't slow down. It's a fast pace, and you got to get to that next thing and next thing, and so it's literally, making you not realize that if you slow down, you'd see something very different.
Yes.
It's the Cliff Notes version, and the Twitter with 140 characters now.
Yes.
Read a book in 5 minutes by watching a YouTube video that gives you the highlights, and it's so totally divorced from context, and that's why it has to be unfulfilling ultimately, and yet we continue to do that.
So it is delicious sometimes. You read the little 8-minute Nietzsche things, you're going, oh man, it's great.
Yeah. So there's Joshua with his opening email, the opening part of his opening 2006 email to Kenneth, where he's reacting to the fact that Kenneth's been posting stuff on the list about mythos and myth, and the idea that a myth is not a lie, that the thing that we call a myth when we mean a lie is something else. We've hijacked the term and we're misusing it. In the same way that when we imagine what was a polytheistic religion like, we imagined that their gods were like our gods, they just had more of them. And so it was about being subservient to either a Chinese menu of pick whichever one you want, or you have to honor all of them. But you would do it the same way that Christianity or Judaism or Islam would do it. And that's not the case at all, right? Because as we alluded to earlier with water, what they mean by divinities in a polytheistic religion are what in the chaos and confusion of life are the things you cannot afford to lose track of, that you have to keep your eye on, because your survival and sanity depend upon those things. And so they become the strange attractors in your life, right? So, I think the idea of water being one of those things is a very polytheistic idea in the original sense of the term. You really can't afford to lose track of where's the clean water and is there enough of it and how do we protect it and put it above other concerns. So this is why he's writing the way he is Joshua is having this reaction to having read all this stuff about myth that's colliding with what he's learned all his life that myth is supposed to mean. Myth is supposed to be a lie or just a story that someone finds entertaining. And instead he's seeing Kenneth talk over and over about this idea of myth as vital to life and sanity and something essential to human nature that we can't even reason without, not sanely. So he responds with this, And of course, this is juicy stuff. So Kenneth goes off and has this whole essay on it. Let's start to get into it here. So spirit and soul, the opening sentence.
Is it possible for Dave to throw up the text? I know he's done that before.
Oh, sure. I could even pop it up. I can share my screen, I think. So I'll do that right now.
Great, really appreciate it.
Here we go. Desktop, share, and here it is. So there's the opening of Joshua's email to Kenneth, where he's talking about the struggle that he's having reconciling the way that Kenneth talks about myth with what he's seen before, and how he's gotten deep enough into understanding this alternative perspective that Kenneth's been putting out, that he's feeling that, we talked in past weeks about the way that if you start to escape the trap of being stuck in a single perspective, and you start to be able to think from multiple perspectives, at first it feels like dislocating your shoulder to switch your mind from one perspective into another. It's extremely uncomfortable. And you can see him talking about that here. It's just, he's got this, as he's learning to have this second socket in his mind for thinking about mythos, it just doesn't feel good. But it also at the same time feels pregnant with something potent. Dave talked about just the scintillating perspective that you get when the more you read Kenneth, the more he's sort of like showing a new light on things. And you get that when you first start picking up a new perspective that contradicts the one you had before, it both hurts and also feels good at the same time, because it doesn't feel comfortable at all, but also some things are coming into focus that you never saw clearly. So the opening paragraph responding to that, this is before section 1, Gnosis and Noesis. I put these section headers in. They weren't in originally. I put them in to make these classes easier, these seminars easier for us, so that we'd have places to look, we could refer to which section it was in. So opening paragraph. So he talks here about the difference between spirit and soul. This is something I was very weak on. I personally was raised as an atheist originally. My dad was and still is, I guess you'd call him a fundamentalist atheist. He doesn't like anything that even smells like religion, and he likes to mock and poke fun at things, and just he can't stop himself. It's like a knee-jerk reaction, and like that's a stage of atheism when you're still really tied to the religion and being in opposition to it, and you don't know who you are if you weren't pushing at it. And so I was brought up that way, and it gradually have morphed into more interesting places than that. But as a result, my dad always said, well, spirit doesn't exist and soul doesn't exist, so there's nothing to talk about here. So this whole area of discussion is something that I was extremely backward on most of my life. The idea that you don't have to have a supernaturalist perspective on the world for there to be reasons why you really desperately need to talk about soul and spirit. That was like an impossible thought for me for most of my life.
I love, just real quick, I love how Ken Smith even describes why this is true, because I always wondered myself, having gone through some of these, I would say period of time I was atheist, period of time I'm agnostic. You see that that they're so aggressive, the atheists, many of them, and they actually enjoy poking fun at spirituality, even though they could just be consistent in their own world and be perfectly happy. Why do they have to be so adversarial? And Ken Smith would say, this is the logical mind. It cannot tolerate any sort of discrepancy in itself.
Yes.
And so because they themselves, atheism is a sort of religious type of thinking, they have so much faith in their propositions and their assumptions, they cannot tolerate any discrepancy there. They have to lash out. I thought that was very interesting how Ken Smith explains why that has to be true.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of a broad brushstroke, but I guess maybe it also kind of just goes to maybe terminology too, I guess. I guess maybe I'd like to just think of atheism like kind of most broadly as just without belief. But what you speak to, I would kind of more describe as anti-theists.
Yes.
Which kind of broadly, like from afar, also is kind of within the atheism umbrella. But I think also kind of tied in there are former theists, former Christians or whatever, that have been traumatized, or, in some way, in their upbringing too, right? So I think that there's some of that kind of rolled into it.
Yes.
That's very fair.
So do atheists see no value in myths?
So this is the thing is there's a lot of different kinds of atheists. Richard's read about this. And one of the ways to think about it is that there are stages of atheism. And there may even, before one can become an atheist, there may be stages of agnosticism in between theism and atheism that one has to work one's way through, sort of struggling with, what did I believe before? Why is that not okay with me now? And where does that put me? This idea that our beliefs are always in motion rather than at a specific place is something that Hegel talks about a lot when he talks about modes of thought, as part of his dialectic, which we're going to talk about a lot over the weeks ahead. So I think about, in my own personal model, the idea that atheism stage 1 and stage 2 are both in opposition to whatever religion you had previously. And atheism stage 1 is when you are against the very specific form of theism that you were brought up in. So if you were never a theist, you're probably never going to be in atheism stage 1. But if you grew up in a specific church and that church drove you away for whatever reason, emotionally, intellectually, what have you, to the point that now you turn against all of it, then that atheism is going to be very particular in its details and in its hostility to, what is it not like? Atheism stage 2 is one that even many people born as atheists get stuck in. And that's where your focus is still, like you said, anti-theist. You're still, whatever it is you might be for, it's hard to focus on that because you have so much energy still tied up with what you're against. And that's the classic critique of the stereotypical atheist, is that they're stuck at stage 2. If they have to tell you what they're for, well, first, if you ask them what they're against, they're passionate and animated, and they can go into great detail. They have whole spiels that they've worked their heads through and that they've written to themselves and others about, and they can download at you for extensively. But if you manage to flip them around and say, but what are you for? Then suddenly all the air goes out of it. And it's like, well, goodness and niceness and not being mean to people. And you get these weird generalities that don't have anything like the precision of the animosity. That's what characterizes stage 2, is that you sort of have some sense vaguely of what it is that you want, but you have a powerful sense of what it is you don't want, and you're still oriented that way. And so one can infer that there could be further stages of atheism beyond that, in which you're sort of disengaging from your hostility and focusing more on, but what do you believe? What are you for? What kind of world are you trying to make? How should we think? How does nature work? How do the gods work? And you have to get quite a ways down that road before you can come back to terminology like spirit and soul and gods and not be hostile and say, what if these things actually have some, not just general tolerance that we could allow people to use those terms, but what if there's actually things that we need to be able to say that we don't have any other words for? And without those words, we're going to find ourselves avoiding topics that are the basis for, sanity and culture and all kinds of things we desperately need.
Meaning.
Yeah.
Essentially, you get to meaning from there, and it's hard to accept meaning when you're talking about the abstract. If your belief system is against, if your belief system is essentially about not believing, then it's going to be very difficult to accept something. That is not able to be proven or able to be, is not tangible, so to speak.
I think that's why when you ask a type 2 atheist, what are you for? They can only fall back on this mimetic form of reasoning. And even Ken Smith says, maybe they are half-baked would-be rebels who emancipate from one cult only by attaching to another, because they can't, they haven't done the work to stand on their own.
Right.
Is this absolutism? In a way?
Well, yeah. This is one of the topics we've talked about for the last 4 weeks in these sessions, is about a recurring theme in Kenneth Smith is this idea that the worst thing that can happen to a human being is to be stuck in a single perspective and to think that you're seeing the world as it really is, or as it really should be, either one, but to be blinkered in this sort of Cyclops mindset. And it's dangerous because, the world as it actually is is so complex and multi-aspectival and full of paradoxes from our perspective, things that don't reconcile from within one perspective, that we sort of are, if we stay stuck in one perspective, we're baking errors into our understanding of ourselves and each other and nature and everything else. So the thing that we have to move to, we have to shift to a level at which we can simultaneously hold multiple perspectives in our head, move back and forth between them and compare them to each other, so they can critique each other's weaknesses and strengths, and so that we can start to learn to use them for where they're best. And that's hard to do, because he comes back to this metaphor of, if you could dislocate your shoulder in a sustainable way, you could reach around to the parts of your back you can't normally reach. Now, your shoulder is not made to do that, and it hurts. But your brain is made to do that. But the first time you start to do it, it still hurts. You've been stuck in a socket so long that the dislocation process feels extremely uncomfortable. And it's not until you learn to cultivate a craving for that ability to escape the trap of a single perspective that you learn to welcome the discomfort and say that, this is my opportunity to get out of the trap and look from another angle and see things. And then you start to want that discomfort because it can show you things. So when you talk about there's sort of a ideological quality to the early stages of atheism and agnosticism, because the person, as Dave alluded to, is trying to flee from one single perspective that they used to think was the one right perspective. Now they want to find the other right perspective that is actually the right perspective, and they want to completely disown the previous one as being 100% false and the new one is 100% true. We stay stuck in we sort of escape one trap while actually being stuck in the larger trap of thinking that any of these traps is freedom.
Right. That makes perfect sense to me.
So that's where I was all my life, really, until Kenneth Smith really got me uncomfortably thinking about topics like spirit and soul and gods and so on, and start to go, actually, I could start to see that he was describing things that are really important and that I just did not have any other terminology for. And in fact, the reason I was backwards on those things was because I had accepted the premises of supernaturalist religions, that spirit must be what they say spirit is, soul must be what they say soul is, gods must be what they say gods are. And therefore, if I didn't like those things, they didn't exist at all. The idea that, no, actually, religions didn't coin these terms per se.
Right.
They're trying to describe something real. Because go ahead.
Because we've learned to outsource that creative mode of thinking. By
Yes.
growing up in this logos culture, we allow others to be creative for us. We allow others to hand us a religion, and we just accept it as though it were perfect and complete in and of itself. And we don't appreciate that we're participating in this process of life. I like that he says, he talks about the I. I made a note. I don't know if he actually said this, but that the I, or the idea of ego or self, it's something that comes at the end of this process.
Yes.
And that we are deluded in thinking we start there and then we use that to puzzle out, what the meaning of life is. Whereas really, the meaning of life comes at the end, after you've gone through the vicissitudes and the ups and the downs and the questioning and all these things for yourself. I think that was a great sort of concept that he had there, and something that I come back to frequently, because our temptation here in dissecting these things is that we're a victim of the very culture that we're seeking to critique. And so we constantly have to remind ourselves of that.
Yes.
The inadequacy of our own critique, because it's grounded in this hyper logos culture, and really try, really make an effort consistently to get away from that. And it may not even be possible at some points.
Right.
I have a sort of general question about that, because I find that really interesting. One of the things that I've been on this philosophical journey I've put myself on is trying to figure out where the I lies, sort of in sort of the development of the maturity of the individual.
Yes.
And I remember first getting into Kierkegaard, and forgive me, I forget which Kierkegaard book, but he talks about going from the individual to the particular to the universal, back to the individual, and that sort of that once you return to the individual, so sort of transcendent, sort of you see yourself, you see your species, you see the whole collectivity, and you become like you assume it within yourself, and then become sort of like that perfect creature. I shouldn't say perfect, but One of the things that I'm struggling with, especially now, and I've sort of in my mind as of late, I've sort of reversed that process where the I or the ego is like the most infantile of all parts of consciousness. We're born I, and as we live, we develop into us, and that's quote unquote us. So I wonder how like Kenneth Smith, and I suppose I continuing to read this book would be definitely very beneficial because I like everybody, I love Kenneth Smith now. I'm so glad you brought him into my own cave. But I really wonder at this sort of ego and this I that is being developed in sort of Dave and how you had presented it. The I is the last stage. And is that sort of a Kierkegaardian I, or is that like this purely ego driven? Like once I've figured out the world, I can finally see myself alone.
That's definitely Kierkegaard. I've got some Kierkegaard in the diagrams I put together for today, because you can't talk about these issues without Kierkegaard. He built off of Hegel's work, but then he just took it so much further and really talked about different kind of levels of the relationship of the self to others, the self to deeper principles or God, the struggles that the self has to go through to overcome where it begins, and all of that stuff, kind of changes the nature of one's self-identity. I got into that particular set of stuff personally early on because of Zen Buddhism, which I got through traditional Okinawan martial arts, where Zen has the criticism right out of the gate that, how dare you say I? How do you even know what you mean by that? You cross that with the philosophical know the seauten, know thyself, which again raises the question, do you even know what you mean by I? It may only be one letter. You may be using it all the time, but do you even know what it means? And then, it's in recent years that as I've gone through Kenneth Smith that I've been able to get the deeper critique of why it is that we wouldn't know who we are to begin with. But I think Nietzsche probably summarizes the intensity of the need to struggle in this area. I forget which journal he put this in when he says, who has done the work to deserve to be able to call themselves an I? It's like, how dare you say I? You don't even know what you mean by that. So much work is required to get to where you can tentatively say, at least in quotes, I-ish.
It's fascinating you bring up Buddhism, particularly Zen, because the pinnacle of that practice is meditation, which is self-observation and understanding the I. For them, that was everything. Just stop and observe yourself. And what are you really? And think about it, but don't think about it.
Yeah, Dowdy, I'm so glad you brought this up because it's core to all of this. So the sense of who you think you are is deeply tied to the modes of thought that you're engaged in. So if you're driven by your appetites, as modernism encourages you to be, right? Modernism says you should be able to work for and buy anything you want. Your wants are what's important. They're your orientation. They're your northern star. Well, actually, they're all over the place. They're your heavens that you keep kind of shifting around from. Now I want a TV set. Now I want to eat this pie. And so the I that is a desirer who believes it has a right to satisfy all of its desires, that's somebody that Heraclitus critiqued when he said it would not be better for men if they got what they wanted. It's like our urges, we are wanting the wrong things. And so as a person struggle out of that, what Kierkegaard called the erotic mode, to try to get some control over yourself and some distance from your appetites and to be able to make choices about who you're going to be, you shift into what Kierkegaard called the poetic mode. This is part of his aesthetic. He's got an aesthetic level of personality. That's the name for this whole layer, in which you begin at the erotic, in which you're driven by desires, but you wrestle with yourself and your desires to try to come up with a architected version of yourself, a chosen version of yourself. That's the poetic. And as you move that way, you become more intellectual. You become more disciplined. You become more separated. And so a poetic personality, even though they're stuck down at the aesthetic level, understands the idea, at least in this one example, that you have to challenge your identity, that you could be somebody other than your appetites. Just because you've always thought of yourself as your desires being innate and essential to your identity doesn't mean it's true. You could make your identity be aligned with your choices and your ideas instead. And so they get that far, the poetic personality, but then they get stuck again. Like we were saying, people getting stuck at atheist stage 2. They say, well, I was wrong to be erotic, but I'm right to be poetic. This is the one truth. So therefore, my choices and my systems of thought are who I am, not my wants. My wants are just something I try to tame, but I am my thoughts. And you see this all over in modernist conceptions of the law, of the pursuit of enlightened self-interest, of a reasonable person, the reasonable person test under the law. All of the basic structures of human beings, abstract human beings that are presented to justify our legal system, our economic system, our social system, everything about how we do the world, they're all at this poetic level of thinking that, you know, you could make your identity aligned with your thoughts, and you are your mind. You are your rational mind. Most people I know who are intellectuals actually do think they are their mind. And you see this with cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So my thoughts must be me. And the idea that previously in our lives, we knew that wasn't true. When we were strictly erotic personalities, it was our desires that we were associated with. We had a different sense of I that we've now forgotten about. And we assumed that that must have been entirely an error. And now that we're correct. And if we could just like escape that second trap and go back and look at the first state more clearly, we would understand that neither our desires nor our thoughts need to define our identity. Our identity could be something else. In fact, as long as we're stuck in one of these two modes, we're slaves to our own minds. Our mind is the master instead of the servant. Our desires become the master instead of the servant, and so forth. So this whole struggle, this is like where almost everybody is at. Almost under Kierkegaard's schema, almost nobody gets past that level of I. They all, you know, he's got two additional layers above that. The ethical is above the aesthetic, and the religious is above the ethical. Why don't I switch just for a moment?
Can I ask? I mean, this is a little bit off top, but is that the same hierarchy that he uses essentially in Fear and Trembling?
Yes.
Yeah.
He uses it throughout his work.
Yeah. So it's like the immediacy, the resignation, and the night of faith, so kind of thing. Where,
yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Thank you for. I know it's a little off, but thank you.
It's not. This is what's so hard about reading Kenneth Smith's work is that he's simultaneously bringing like a dozen different dimensions to bear on every sentence. And so at any point, it's perfectly reasonable to say, let's just go out and explore this dimension to make sure we understand what he's saying here, because he's thinking all these things. He goes back and works and reworks his writing to make sure that it's not false according to one of these perspectives. Now in the emails, he's looser, right? It's more, but the shorter emails he's looser. The longer emails like this one are more like essays, and he goes through revisions. So it's reasonable to do this level of interrogation of the text because he's already done that level. So let's look at the
name that was brought up. Sorry, that was in the question. There was a name that was brought up in the question. I missed it.
Fear and Trembling.
Yeah, Fear and Trembling.
Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, the night of immediacy, resignation, and faith as a form of a structure, as what Rick just explained, as to how Kierkegaard views the lowest level of humans, and then there's this gradual kind of all the way to the night of faith.
Yes.
So basically, you know, there's limitations, and then again, I'm just reading it for the first time, but the night of faith is able to embrace the absurd kind of thing, if I remember correctly. So
yes,
I'm reading Kierkegaard for the first time, so I'm a little bit.
He's a challenge.
I'm not the guy to be talking right now.
I'm glad you brought it up.
It is a challenge. It's been a challenge.
There's not a single work of Kierkegaard's that I've read cover to cover yet. So you're ahead of me. I've done a lot of dipping in and studying him from angles, but I haven't yet done a full immersion. So my kudos to you. It's challenging. And I know one of the things that makes him hard to read is because, like Nietzsche, he wasn't overly concerned with whether anybody else understood what he was saying. And there's two ways that you know that that's true. One of them is the famous quote from him where he says, you know, thinking about what he was going to do with his life, he looked around and saw, you know, heroic person after heroic person was making life easier. And he thought to himself, what if instead I could make everything harder? And, you're like, why would you even say that? And
right.
at first, your initial reaction is, that's just mean. But then eventually you think about it and you realize, no, actually, things that come too easy, they're the familiar for that very reason is not recognized for what it is, said Hegel.
Yes.
And Kierkegaard knew that line. So he's thinking, how do I make you go back and look at the things you think you already know in a harder way that makes you see the things that were always there that you weren't able to see? Like, who am I? And what am I doing when I'm thinking? So that's one way that you know that Kierkegaard was not overly concerned with whether you really could easily understand what he's saying. He was more concerned with doing the deep dive, whether you could follow or not. The other way, and I only learned this, this is how you know I haven't read extensive Kierkegaard yet. I only learned this last month, is that because he wrote from different personas' perspectives, and some of the personas' perspectives, well, pretty all of the personas' perspectives had limited points of view that saw some things clearly and some things as errors. He's actually writing dialogues.
Right.
And it takes a while to work out which of the things from that perspective does Kierkegaard also agree with, and which things does Kierkegaard think are just ridiculous for that person to think, except so many people think that way, he needs to show it to you so that you can see the thinking taking place. So we can't just like randomly grab lines out of Kierkegaard and quote them, because we could be saying the opposite of what Kierkegaard meant. Kierkegaard might have been quoting that to say, see how stupid this is when somebody says this.
No, you need to read it in its totality, because that's where I started trying to grab things initially. And then I was like, well, this doesn't make sense. So, and that's why it's so hard too. It's a journey. He didn't have to make it this hard.
Yeah.
But it's part of the discovery itself, I guess.
Yeah. And the when he forces you to do the work, it gets your mode into working mode.
Yeah.
Your mind starts being willing to do work it wouldn't otherwise do, because it's already having to struggle. And so things we might have taken for granted, we might be willing to question, I think was what he was thinking would happen. So here's his basic framework. And part of what he was, he started out as a more naive Christian, and he developed into a more sophisticated Christian as he went along, as he developed his philosophy. Which is how come he ended his life writing quote unquote Attack on Christendom, where he was just like, he'd had it up to here with Danish Christianity as being just a betrayal of Jesus, and a failure to do the things that Christianity was at its best could help you do. The way that he's writing things is from that perspective, and he's kind of growing through his struggle with it. So like Nietzsche, he's a moving target. You have to be thinking about, when did he write this and what was he talking about? But generally what emerges from this is this, he was a Hegelian. He had read Hegel. He totally was into this idea that things are not things. They are in motion and in struggle. They're becoming from something to something. And that if you want to understand something, you have to explain where it is in its struggle. And so he didn't just talk about the aesthetic personality as one mode of thought. He talked about it as a struggle between two modes of thought. The poetic trying to emerge from the erotic, or the erotic not liking the poetic and trying to resist it and trying to shove it away as wrong. When people say, don't think too much, just give me your first two answers, to this question, but don't think about it. That's an erotic impulse to believe that the initial impulse is more accurate than thinking. A poetic personality would never think that way. Poetic personality is like, no, if I haven't examined it, the unexamined life's not worth living. If I haven't separated myself from it and molded over, then how do I know it's what I truly believe? These are like opposite modes, but he puts them together into a single level, the aesthetic. And he's trying to describe, from his perspective, what he saw as paganism, the modes of mind available to the pre-Christian world, right? And as he saw it as a struggle between nature and will. What is your intrinsic nature? What are you born with? What are you suffering in your life as a pathos? What are you immersed in and penetrated by? Versus what do you choose for yourself in resistance against that nature? What do you decide? I'm not going to, have that next cookie just because I want it. Maybe I'll wait until after dinner, or maybe I won't eat it at all. I'm not going to hit you just because I'm angry. I'm going to think about my choices, about what I want to do. So that whole process that we go through in growing up, he saw as involving a certain amount of journey out of the complete erotic and towards the poetic. And people stop at different places, but some people go all the way into an ultra poetic mode. And he called this overall thing the aesthetic. Now, Kenneth Smith sort of equates the aesthetic with his term, the banausic. But he really means, what Kenneth really means, the poetic when he says it aligns with the aesthetic. It means that ultra intellectualized, hyper Apollonian mode where you're focusing on your will instead of on what you were endowed with by nature. And he talks about the dualic as being on the erotic side, right? Where the dualic really just suffers life and suffers its own feelings and drives and lives a life of being a symptom of what its circumstances are. Now, Kierkegaard wanted to arrange this into a hierarchy that leads towards the highest forms of Christianity. So for him, the highest form of personality is the religious, by which he doesn't really mean the polytheistic, or, he doesn't really mean religious in general, although he does mean something very generalized from Christianity by it. He means, can you get to a point where you're not being driven by your appetites or your will or your thought processes or by what society around you says is right or wrong, but where you actually discover the deeper principles of life, the universe and everything, and you're aligned to those. For Kierkegaard, God was a source of meaning, and the meaning is deeper than what you feel and what you think or what society wants from you. And so, what does it take? What kind of journey do you have to go through personally? What kind of revolutions do you have to have in your thinking to get to the point where you can lift yourself up, if you're the sort of person who has the capabilities to do that through the stages that lead there? So Kierkegaard. You brought up Kierkegaard. I thought I'd just take us back to Kierkegaard for a moment, because what we're going to find is all these topics: mythos and logos, Verstand and Begriff, thesis, antithesis, dualic, banausic, all this stuff lines up with Kierkegaard. Not in an equation. They're not identical, but they're inspired by and affect each other and are, can be reconciled into a schema, which is what Kenneth Smith did. That was his big philosophical accomplishment, is to pull together all these very difficult thinkers and say, what is kind of the superset system that they were driving at from their different perspectives. Okay, let's go back to the text.
Okay, that's fine.
So spirit and soul, right? He alludes to them right here. We've seen references to them elsewhere, and we've seen, even before we started this series on Mythos and Logos, we had a couple where we talked about spirit and soul. I remember Sharon, we had some great discussions about that a month or so ago. And for Kenneth Smith, that's deeply attached to this subject, the way that he defines soul and spirit. Like, he defines neither of them in terms of a supernatural object that exists separately from your body. He neither says that's what they are, nor that that's not what they are. He says whether or not that's what they are is irrelevant. That they have another additional level of meaning that's crucial, whether you're a naturalist or a supernaturalist. You sort of can't talk about the human mind and human nature without these terms with their proper definitions, because they're describing critically important things we don't have any other words for. So let's tie them right now. Let's see how this plugs in before we go on. We're in the first sentence. We're already looking at diagrams and schemas and talking about philosophers. This is what I mean about the density. So I'm going to scroll up a little to Hegel. We know that to be a Hegelian is not to believe everything Hegel said, because we're not talking about faith here. It's to see that his structure for describing nature and thought and reality is a potent one. It's a great model that allows us to illuminate things more clearly than a lot of other ways that we might take. Specifically, this idea that things are always in struggle and in transformation. This comes right from Heraclitus. Heraclitus said, right, you can't step in the same river twice, because it's always changing. It's always flowing. And that you can't step in the same river twice because you're always changing. From the time that you begin moving your foot to the time that the foot lands in the river, you've already changed. The river has changed, you've changed. It's like there's a deep, radical flux going on in the world. And this comes out of the old archaic Greek belief that people are seeds, that we are always becoming something else. Aliosis is the term, othering. We're always becoming other than what we are now. All of nature is pregnant with its future selves. Every natural thing was born out of something previously pregnant and is itself pregnant with future possibilities that it is going to become. so that there are seeds of order inside of us that are constantly unfolding, that are helping to make us change over time. And that's one set of ideas that came out of Heraclitus. The other set of ideas that came out of Heraclitus, he says, war is the father of all things. He says, people do not understand how that which is at variance with itself can agree with itself. He says, internal struggles in systems produce motion. And in the world around us, there are things in there are deep principles that are pushing in different directions. And the conflicts between those pushes generate the motion that we see, like a vector. Anyone who took physics or calculus, you did vector work where you say this vector intersects that vector and the new vector heads off in a combination of the two. That's Heraclitean. He said that over and over in non-mathematical ways, that's the structure of the universe, right? He says, specifically, he uses the example of the bow and the lyre. He says the structure of the forces in the world is such that in living systems, they're bent back upon each other. The two things that are in conflict are harnessed to each other so that they can do work. So you pull on the string and the string pulls on the bow. If you pull on the bow pulls on the string, and as a result, you can fire an arrow. And if the two things weren't harnessed to each other, if they weren't tensed against each other, if their forces weren't bent back onto each other, it couldn't do that work and it wouldn't be a bow. And the same thing is true of a lyre making music. The strings are tensed against the tension of the wood. They pull against each other. And it's because of the tension that you can pluck them and make music and harmonies. And the potential for harmony and music is there even before you pick up the lyre. The tension is innate to it, as is all the possible kinds of work that it could do. All the songs the lyre could play are already there waiting to be played because of the way that the tension has been aligned between the strings and the wood. You see what I mean? He says this is what we mean as Greeks when we say that the future is pregnant with the seeds of the future. All these possibilities are already there. And as people, we're not isolated from nature, but we're part of nature. And so we ourselves are like the wood or like the string. We're harnessed into larger things that we don't understand, but we're harnessed into them anyway. And that as we're plucked or nature is plucked, we together can produce new phenomena that couldn't be seen in advance if we didn't understand the system that we're bound up as a part of. There's sort of layers and layers and layers of things being parts of larger things, which are parts of larger things, which are parts of larger things, each of which has its own tensions, different forces in conflict that are all harnessed to each other. If they're not harnessed to each other, what you have is a non-living system, right? You go to a pile of rocks and you push on one of the rocks in the pile and it falls over. The end. It didn't do anything else. That was all it had. And now the system's changed. It didn't return itself to the tense state. It had no continuity. So Hegel read all this stuff in Heraclitus. He really molded over. And he put together out of that this system of dialectics. Dialectics is an attempt to kind of mathematicize Heraclitus and say, if you have two forces, then the union of those two forces is going to produce a new force in a new direction. And that applies to things. Things aren't things. Things look like things to us because of the nature of our language. We have nouns, and we think of nouns as these platonic, unchanging ideals. But in truth, every noun is also a process or a whole bunch of processes together that have forces within them and that are undergoing some kind of process of change. And so anything's coming together creates some kind of a larger new whole from each other. And where the real potency in Hegel's dialectic come in is the idea that as a result, you don't even need two things. Even one thing by itself has internal conflicts. And inevitably, it will also have, as a result, a process of change that sets it in opposition against its own antithesis. Every thesis implies an antithesis. And we can see it in the world. As we move and do things, we provoke reactions. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, says Newton, right? This is ahead of Newton. This is sort of foretelling this idea as applying to everything. And that as a result, you get what happens is when you reconcile them, you don't get a compromise. This is something that just doesn't fit in modernist politics at all. We think that what you do is between opposing views, you find a compromise. And a compromise means nobody wins, which means nobody gets what they want, which means nobody's needs are really met. And we all just sort of say, oh, well, at least we didn't have a civil war. right? This is sort of where moderns are stuck. The level in American politics is sort of stuck at that level because we don't understand that, if you actually look at opposing positions as movements, then you could apply Hegelian dialectics to them and produce a new movement out of them that didn't just cancel out most of the energies and leave us with a lukewarm sting in the middle that didn't make anybody happy. We could produce a new movement that incorporated all of that energy into a new direction, that was capable of showing and revealing and doing things that neither of the two by itself could do because they were inadequate to the task. So you see what I'm after here? I'm belaboring the dialectics, but for a reason, because everything that follows is based on this. Does this sort of make sense as an abstract model?
Yes, absolutely.
So basically, if Hegel has a system of philosophy, if it can be said to be true, what he has done is systematize Heraclitus and then apply it to every major question of philosophy. And each of his books that he wrote was one topic run through dialectics, and said, if we don't think about it from a Platonic or Kantian perspective as being some kind of abstract, unchanging truth, if instead we think about forces in energy, in conflict, reconciling to create new things, what would that mean for the mind? What are the different kinds of things in conflict when we think? What are the different kinds of things in conflict in nature? What are the kinds of things in conflict in history? These are his books, right? Just, you could go down the list. Each of them is this done to one subject. So you can see why people were really excited about this. They're like, can't believe this potent little tool for philosophy has uncovered and revealed all these ideas from a new perspective. That you could take the same issues that Kant or Plato talked about and run them through dialectics, and you get a completely different model of the mind, but one that encompasses Kant's ideas. And that's what we see with Hegel's Geist, his phenomenology of Geist.
So it allows for new discoveries, essentially. Right. So
yeah,
it's an open system that allows for new discoveries.
Because the synthesis is now the new thesis.
Right, exactly.
And so it will provoke its own antithesis. Even before it interacts with the world, which might provide an antithesis of its own, it will still provoke its own antithesis, which will therefore create the need for a new synthesis. And so thus we get the motion of history and the embryogenesis from a fertilized egg to a full human being, right, in the womb. Everything is this just unfolding iteratively over and over. So in the mind, he has this core concept, and Kierkegaard and Hannah Arendt and Nietzsche and Kenneth Smith all build off of this idea. And his idea is that we have two hemispheres of the mind that are working two different modes of thought, and they do it together. They're harnessed through the corpus callosum, but they have different tendencies, right? They have different preferences. They have different approaches to the world. And what we find is that there is this begriff mode that is very immersed in nature. It's immersed in its own human nature. It's immersed in the nature of the world around us. It's immersed in what we taste and feel and sense, what we remember. It's immersed in how we feel and what we want. Anything that is a pathos or a suffering or a concrete immediacy is part of begriff reasoning. We talked about this in previous weeks. We talked about begriff. But in opposition to that, and in naturally developing out of it in our process of maturation as human beings, we develop this additional faculty of Verstand, the potential for which we're born with, which is the capacity to abstract from reality and to think thoughts that we never experienced in the real world, but that are generalizations or are logical deductions from those generalizations. And that's Verstand, abstractivizing thinking, rationalist, logical thinking, right? And that the things that make Verstand powerful are that it's able to disengage from the live wire immediacy of begriff. As we talked about in the first essay in this particular series, the challenge of begriff is that an infant is too live wire. Everything is new and electric and engaging, and it allows for no continuity. You're just pulled from one experience to the next, right? Now I'm angry. Now I'm happy. Now the world sucks. Now the world is fabulous. It's like you can't make a civilization out of that. You can't even make a human personality out of that. It's too. Even animals aren't that live wire. Even they have some ability to get some distance and to. For example, you should learn from experience. You can't learn from experience if the current experience is all encompassing and leaves no room for anything else. So you've got to start to segment off the current experience you're having from an additional segment of the brain that's able to reflect upon it, draw off of memory, do reasoning based on it, and to allow you to make choices other than the immediate obvious choice. Like, last 5 times I touched that hot stove, I burned my hand. Hey, even though the flame is pretty, maybe this time I won't touch the pretty flame. Right? This is a Verstand thing to do. On the one hand, it's drawing off of concrete begriff experience for sure, but reasoning out that, if I change my behavior and distance myself from my desire, I'm doing a Verstand thing. It's a little Verstand thing, but it's a Verstand thing. And there's a direct line that leads from maybe this time I don't touch the pretty flame to the Critique of Pure Reason by Kant. It's a direct line. Because if you go all the way down that road to Verstand, you become Kant. You effectively immerse yourself in this logicalist, rationalist, Vulcan worldview, in which the perfect life is the life in which everything is considered, and there's nothing unexamined, and you've made all the rational choices. That's like where Verstand wants to go. Very abstractivized, very chosen life, very artificialist life. Able to maintain a distance from feelings and experience and reality and values and meaning and God.
Is that absolutism in there? Like, essentially?
Yeah. If you keep going, it becomes another absolutist point of view.
And that's where he comes up with his categoricals, I mean, I guess, to a certain degree.
Yeah.
Is that okay.
Yeah. Because what happens is when you're in the middle, it's hard. It's like your brain is out of socket, right? It's easy to be in a fully begriff or mostly begriff socket of the mind. It's also easy, although you have to work to get there, to stay in a fully Verstand socket of the mind.
Right.
But it is extremely uncomfortable to be in between. Because are you being true to yourself emotionally? If you're not being true to yourself emotionally, the more you abstract, the less you're being true to yourself emotionally. It feels like a betrayal of yourself. You get this sort of thing that many, many, many people in Apollonian culture feel, which is imposter syndrome, right? Is this even me? Is any of this, you've so detached from the certainties of how you felt that you're no longer sure about anything. Like, you could have been a programmer for 40 years, but you still wonder, am I a fake? Are other programmers really doing it and I'm not? Because you're ungrounded. You've become too abstract. But by the same token, you have the opposite problem. If you're starting to build yourself an identity as a rational, reasoning person, and you betray that and do something emotional, especially if it goes badly, it's very easy to say, it went badly because I let my feelings be in charge and I should never do that, right? If I'd only been more rational, more logical, more reasonable, that mistake wouldn't have happened. And this is how you see Apollonians shuffling away the Holocaust as being not actually a rational thing. It was just an emotionalist thing, because they can point to the emotional sides of it and say, oh, look, they were bigoted. They had feelings. And because they had feelings, that must have been the cause of the Holocaust. So therefore, I don't have to think any more about that. I just have to be even more rationalist and more logical and more intellectual than the Nazis were. And then surely only goodness will follow. There is that distrust of superstition and mythos and emotion that comes naturally. The more you get into Verstand, the more you're like, I shouldn't stay in this in-between place. I should go the rest of the way. I should become Spock. So they sort of exclude each other. Kierkegaard says that. It's like there's sort of a magnetism, opposing magnetism between them. Being in the middle is really hard. It's much easier to be on one side or the other. As far as that feeling of at least you're being authentic, at least you're being consistent. Right? At least the world as it makes sense to a begriff mind seems coherent and complete. And the world as it makes sense to a Verstand mind seems complete and logical and coherent. But when you're stuck in the middle, you can constantly see the incoherencies of the ways you're making choices. And that feels risky and uncomfortable and like it's not a thing. It's a between state. So they tend to oppose each other. People tend to flip to one side or the other. But what Hegel gets at when he talks about this, he says, but the problem is they're both half-witted perspectives on the world. There's a reason why we have two hemispheres and not one hemisphere. We don't just call it a sphere, right? The mind had to be divided against itself. You both have to be able to pay attention to what's happening right now, and you have to be able to abstract from it and compare it to past experiences and draw conclusions. If you can only do one thing or the other, you're dead. It's like we find, hemispheric structured brains in almost all animals. It's no matter how primitive you are, pretty quickly, I mean, unless you're a jellyfish that doesn't have a brain at all, pretty quickly when you start developing a brain, you develop a split because the ability to do both functions is critically important.
This is why Smith refers to genius as seeking the excluded middle.
Yes. Yes. So, yeah. So Hegel spends a lot of time talking about the opposition and between the two and the dialectic between them two and how they work. He doesn't. I haven't finished reading the Phenomenology of Geist. I don't know what terminology he introduces for philosophy, but it's clear that's what he means. Philosophy is the stage at which you bring the forces of Begriff and the forces of Verstand. You don't look for an insipid middle point, but you reconcile the forces with each other to create a new force that moves you to a new whole that encompasses both of the previous ones. And that's philosophy. That's what you're trying to do. The philosophy of the mind should be that you transcend either of those traps and actually have binocular vision and be able to see the world simultaneously, concretely, and abstractly, to use the two, to create a whole-on, to create the sphere that the two hemispheres promise but so often fail to deliver. And part of what's interesting about this is he calls it Geist, the German word Geist. You could see some translations say the phenomenology of the mind, and some translations say the phenomenology of spirit. And he didn't write two different books. It's the one word. We don't have a word for this in English. We literally can't say this idea that is simultaneously the mind and spirit, or the mind as spirit. Because in English, spirit doesn't mean any part of the mind. Spirit is a supernatural thing that, moves outside the body or lives in the body until you die, or there's various, but it's separable in some concept from the body, the way that we understand the word spirit to mean. And that's not what he means at all. I mean, he was a Christian. He believed in these ideas, but this word that he's using didn't mean those things. On purpose, he didn't mean those things. So why did I come back to this? Soul and spirit, right? We were in the opening sentence. We're still in the opening sentence. Yeah, we're talking about soul versus spirit. So one of the powers of Begriff, part of the reason to feel immersed in the world concretely, is so that you have an identity. The thing that Begriff can do that Verstand can't do, the thing that Begriff can do really well, is it can create a whole. The things you're feeling all belong together. You have a powerful sense of being someone. Specific, right? The things I feel, the feelings I have about those things, my immediate live wire immersion of the world creates a strong sense of identity in massive opposition to cogito ergo sum. Cogito ergo sum is more like wishful thinking. All rationalists wish that the process of thinking would make us feel like a whole person, but it doesn't. We end up instead with imposter syndrome. It's the feeling of feeling things and feeling driven and feeling connected. When you take a hike in the forest and you're looking at trees and you're looking at the moss and you're checking the roots and rocks to make sure you don't trip over things as you walk, and suddenly it turns right, and all of a sudden it opens up and the sun's shining down at an angle and there's a gentle mist falling and there's all this hanging moss, and in the distance you can hear a waterfall, and none of that was visible right before you turned. And you suddenly stop in awe and you're just shocked into the moment. You feel more like somebody at that moment than at any other time in your life. You feel completely real, completely present, completely in the world, while simultaneously completely being somebody in the world. That ability to have an identity and be a whole is something that Begriff is great at. Kenneth Smith calls that soul. He says the mind as a whole, as an entity, as a complete living thing, as an organism, is a soul. Before you make any decisions, before you exercise your will, while it coheres as a self, that's how Kenneth Smith uses the word soul. And he draws this out of Thomas Aquinas and Augustine and Hildegard von Bingen and other mystics who wrote during the medieval era, as well as from the Greeks. Here he's actually incorporating the medievalist epoch's perspectives as well as the ancient perspectives, because he says soul and spirit are topics that both previous epochs did far better than the modernist epoch. The modernist epoch has no time for soul or spirit. Right? The ultra-rationalist stage 2 atheist who denies the reality of God and also thinks that human will and reason should be preeminent over even nature, even over ourselves. That's modernism's kind of default mode. It's possible to live in the modern epoch and still admire God or nature, but not in the way that a medieval would have or an ancient would have, because our default mode is reason and logic and the education that we went through, right? All the terminology we've picked up, the conventions of the society, the money and so forth. So that's why he had to go back to get the word soul. And so there's a linkage here. Soul is associated with the natural living organism of the mind and of your identity. And Hegel uses this, he uses German terms. So I can't say that Hegel used the word soul the same way, but he used the equivalent term in German. And he sets that in opposition against spirit, which he associates with Verstand. Right? And the reason that he does that, he says, and I forget who he's quoting. It might be Aquinas, but it might not. Says, spirit is soul in motion. When the soul makes decisions and choices and starts to apply itself against the immersive experience of life and begins to voluntarily choose directions and begin to go that way, it is taking the soul on a journey that the soul wouldn't have gone on by itself. The soul would have just stayed immersed in life. But the spirit activates us to do seemingly contranatural things. I choose not to eat this cookie. Yes, it's my favorite cookie, but I just had 12 of them. And I think 13 would break the bank. My stomach's still ready for it. My eyes are ready. My tongue is ready. I want it. It makes me remember my mom cooking in the kitchen, and I can be closer to her if I eat this cookie. But I'm choosing not to eat the cookie. The will exerts itself and puts the soul into motion, contrary to what it naturally, necessarily would have done. And it becomes capable of amazing things as spirit, right? Soul is like all this potential energy, and spirit is like all, the kinetic energy that results from that. When Heraclitus says, pull the bow and then release, and the arrow begins to go in motion, the release, the activity, the work that's being done is spirit. And so you could see this with traditional Okinawan martial arts. They tell you that the reason that you do the drills, right, to do the movements, and you do them over and over, but you try to put your whole heart into them, right? When you punch, don't just punch like I'm trying to get to 10 so I can be done. Punch each time into the air like it's really happening and you really need to punch, and you make it as real as you could possibly make it. You sort of exert your soul to reach beyond its default mode and to make itself 100% alive and willing something to take place. You're developing your willpower, your capacity to even have willpower and to make choices and to make them completely. They talk about that as spirit, the karate spirit. You're trying to build your spirit. You're trying to develop your spirit. You're practicing the act of willing things and making them happen so that you can do it again and again and do it better and better than you did before. Spirit is something that has to be developed. And when Augustine and Aquinas and others talk about spirit, they too talk about, if you want to live in the Christian spirit, you have to study and practice how to be a good person, how to give, how to overcome your selfishness, how to overcome the many things that come naturally to us, but that don't allow us to make a better world. So, soul and spirit. Does this make sense?
It makes sense, but are they, when I think of a dichotomy, I tend to naturally think of two things that are opposite each other. And to me, I don't see that opposition between soul and spirit.
You haven't read the Phenomenology of Geist, have you?
No, I have not.
See,
no.
Hegel will fix that for you.
Oh,
because
gosh.
because as he shows, Begriff and Verstand are opposing modes of the mind. Soul and spirit are opposing modes of the mind. You can be yourself and be present without actually engaging your will at all. In fact, if you get into meditation, Zen meditation, one of the things they're practicing is to get your spirit to shut up and to go back into your soul. And it turns out to be really hard because we're so busy in our modernist culture. We're so used to being trapped on the spirit side of things that we lose any sense of our soul. Who are we? What really matters? What's important? We lose that stuff. We're like, I have to do the next thing to pay the next bill. Go, 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 go.
So it's interesting. I guess we are equating, like Sharon was asking in the chat, I guess we are equating spirit with will. And maybe I would say, in my own mind, not necessarily bound to these definitions we just discussed, for me, spirit is sort of the go-between between soul and willpower. I see it as sort of the bridge between and the interplay between. But I guess what we're saying here is spirit is more associated with will.
Well, I could easily be oversimplifying this. Remember, I'm a student too. I'm still learning. But I think the key thing is that the dichotomy that's being set up is that the more we reason about the world, which is mental action, or the more we do things in the world, which is physical action, the more we're focused on those things and not on who we are and what our experience is. So in Empire Strikes Back, Yoda goes at Luke over and over about never his mind is on where he is, on what he's doing. He's not able to act while being completely present in the moment. Every time he acts, he abstracts from himself and gets lost thinking about all the reasons why it might be shameful or good to do this thing or that thing. And is he doing a good job? And does Yoda think he's stupid? And he's like stuck in all this busyness and he can't actually be present as a soul.
So we're saying soul is myth and spirit is more logos.
Well, they're related to each other. Each of these things can't be quite equated, but they're related to each other. And it's as we trace out the relationships that all of this really comes into focus. That's where the really interesting part is. So the part you just did is how we get started. We get started by sort of lining them up a bit with each other, as long as we do that and know that they're not equated. They're like drawing off of similar realms. So, part of the idea of Christian spirituality is to put the soul in motion from its default mode into a mode that rises up to something better. And that's drawing off of the old Greek idea that as a personality, as a mind, it's your job to rise up above what came naturally to you, what you were born with. You have to overcome yourself. When Nietzsche says man is a problem that must be overcome, he's invoking the challenge of spirit, that you have to build your spirit up to become someone who's capable of doing something other than your default behavior. And certainly it's true that even if an all spirit, no soul mode of life is a trap, just like all one or the other is a trap. But to get to the second trap, you have to exert your spirit. You have to exert yourself to overcome what comes naturally. And the process of doing that teaches you something about the ability to become something other than what you are right now. This is what Kierkegaard talks about as one of the important parts of the journey from the erotic to the poetic, is that the poetic discovers the capacity to transcend oneself. And that discovery, even though the poetic is just as trapped as the erotic is, that discovery is important to moving on then to the ethical and religious layers. Because until you've done that movement, you don't know that it's possible to be somebody else, to become different. Sharon, you got your hand up?
Yeah. Can you comment on the concept? And this is the way I've understood it, that the soul is the immortal part of your being. And that's one of the fundamental things of Christian theology. And this is mythical. When you die, your soul goes to heaven.
Right.
Right? And so the soul is immortal. And in life, it's driven by the spirit. The spirit is the will and the soul is immortal. And the two of them, I don't want to say, kind of interact with each other. I know there's another part of it where, you talk about the collective unconscious. Is that a collection of souls? That's one thing that I've wondered about. and this is getting really, really deep here. But I know the soul is an essential part of your being, and it has an experience of its own. And I've resuscitated enough people in my life and talked to them and have them come back and tell you about the soul experience.
Yes.
And it's the same story.
Yes.
So the soul has got to be, I think, I am seeing the soul as immortal and having its own characteristic. And I'm trying to figure out how these two, what's the interplay between the two?
So let me do it in a funny way.
Yes.
And I mean funny, strange. I'm going to do it in a funny, peculiar way. And I'm going to say that even though when Hegel and Kierkegaard use the words soul and spirit, they mean it something like the way you just said it. Right?
Yeah.
They meant that there is an immortal part. Right? They were both Christian. Okay. So they meant that there was an immortal part. But it's possible to read this without that and see an enormous amount of meaning in it. And so I'm not going to take a position on whether the soul is immortal or not. Mm-hmm. But I'm going to say what gets interesting in this is not looking at the mythic side of whether the soul lives on after death, but to look at, regardless of whether it does, even if it does, it has a structure and laws that these guys are exploring. What is the nature of the thing that lives on? See, the focus in a lot of Christian theology is on just drawing the line, putting the word soul on it, saying it lives on, and then we're done. That's what you need to know about soul. That's the important part. But what Hegel and Kierkegaard and the others are doing here is inverting the relationship and saying, you're not done. There's so much to soul that needs to be explored. Mm-hmm. And that even while we're alive, even if there's no life after death, but even if there is, while we're alive, the structure of the soul and its laws are very important to figure out, and its relationship to spirit. This topic also goes all the way back to Heraclitus. One of the things that is hard for us to see about Christianity today is that Christianity was very different early on. Yes. The early Christians were Heracliteans, not Platonists. And there was a revolution in Christianity in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries where they overthrew that and they decided to be Neoplatonists instead. And they went through and purged a bunch of writings. They changed a bunch of quotes to make it seem more Platonic. And Augustine built off of that. But the idea of soul that was originally part of Christianity drew off of Heraclitus more. And Heraclitus talks about soul a little bit in terms of the afterlife. He does. He talks about that. But he also talks about the structure. And this is what Hegel's built off of here. So what is the structure of the soul? How does it behave? What are its internal forces? Why does it interact in us the way that it does? What does it do for us? And what do we do for it? He's got a quote that says, you couldn't plumb the depths of the soul even if you had all of eternity to do it in. The soul is a very complicated subject. Human character and mind and will are profound subjects. They're infinitizing. They're not finite subjects like saying, what's the weight of an apple? You can't just make a list of facts and be done. It's more like something you have to explore and explore and explore and try to figure out, because there's as much to learn in that subject as there is to learn outside of our heads. If we look around us in the world and we say, oh my God, you have to learn about trees and sunshine and grass and where does food come from and air, and there's all this stuff. Heraclitus is asserting there's just as much stuff to try to figure out about the structure of the soul and how it works in us. It's a second infinity.
And that's why myth is so important, because it's the transference of our humanity's attempt to process these concepts over time.
Yes.
As opposed to just, the logical mind seeing things at a point in time that something can be described, succinctly.
Yes.
These things take generations to figure out, and that's where myth comes into play.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, just a general question on that point.
Yeah.
So when Kenneth Smith is writing, he's sort of looking at his contemporary world and seeing a type of void of myth. But how can one within the world recognize the myth that is being created as they speak, or that is being continued, or like reattached in some way, shape, or form? Because I don't know, I sort of look at, yes, we don't have myths that are like gods and goddesses and sort of that type of thing, but who's to say something like Wuthering Heights isn't a myth, or like J.R. Tolkien isn't a myth, or Lord of the Rings? Like, what makes the myths of the ancients differ in terms of the feeding of sort of this continual process of spirit than the myths that we have now, save for the fact that like neoliberalism and economics has totalized our minds so much that we like, it doesn't seem like a problem with myths. It just seems a problem with other aspects or other areas of society aggrandizing themselves so much that they suppress. But like the myths are still there and they're never really going to pop out. We're still creating them. They're just underground in that sense. So I like what makes it so Smith would look at today's society. And again, this is something that we have absolutely talked about, and it's really, really great. But I'm still like, I
Yes.
love art so much. I love
Yes.
novels so much. Why
Yes.
can't these things be myths? And why can't these be parts that are continuing?
I have 3 answers.
Mm.
Oh. So the first answer is, God, you have a gift for asking the right question.
Right.
That question is what this entire book is trying to answer. And it takes the whole book to do it. And I may end up finding a few more essays that need to be tacked on to the end just before we fully get there. But it's a deep subject. You've asked the killer question. That's the one. The second answer is, I'm not going to tell you. Because I think we'll be in a better position to answer it after we get through a few more essays. But it's an important question to answer. It's just I don't think I'm competent to do so until we've built up more of this kind of shared perspective on the world. But the third and final answer before I call on Sharon is that he would say there's one of the challenges for us in English is that English is very fuzzy about terminology to describe processes and the products that they generate. Greek was very good at that. Greek had different endings you could stick on nouns to say, if this is the core noun, what is the process that generated that noun? Or if this is a process, what is the word for the kind of thing it generates? So myth as a process versus myth as a mode of thought versus myth as a myth that was generated out of those modes of thoughts or processes would all be different things in Greek. And we'd be able to say precisely which question we're asking and which thing we're talking about. But in English, we can't say any of these things precisely. We just sort of cobble together enough words to try to circle around the area of which thing that we mean. And as a result, the language is very clumsy and our ability to communicate it is clumsy. But one way to sort of vaguely work in this area is to say that Kenneth Smith would argue there is a mythic mode of mind and storytelling, which is different from a logos mode of mind and storytelling, and that even when we don't have a shared mythos as a culture, and even when our culture is an anti-culture that tries to exterminate that style of thinking and to make sure that we don't have any shared myths so they can keep selling us these little ersatz stories to buy a little time before we buy another one. Nevertheless, there are people who are freaks, throwbacks, outliers, weirdos, who have slipped through the cracks in some way because nothing's perfect, not even Apollonian systems. And they have enough of the right characteristics that they are drawn to mythic things. So like fans of the Greek myths and Japanese myths and so on often have a little bit of a touch of that in their brains, that it's an appetite that they have. They need it. They want it. They want to see more of it. And some of them go on to become writers. And some of those writers really do somehow figure out how to stick with that mythic mode and generate pretty weird mythic stories that if we had a mythic culture could be part of the process of mythologizing that would become our shared mythology. But where we are, where everything is atomized and split up and turned into products, the mythic activities that they're doing don't result in any shared mythos that we're all immersed in as part of our cultural nature. It ends up being something that fellow fans can be immersed in. And of those fans, only some of them will be immersed in it at a mythic level. Most of them will be immersed in it as consumers. Well, I bought this thing, I like it. I'll put it on a t-shirt. And it's a minority of them who are like, I have to learn how to speak Klingon. I'm so into this idea of the honor-bound culture. I must be a Klingon. It's like, okay, now they're really going for it, right? But the number of Americans or people around the world who could speak Klingon to each other and who want to do the ceremonies and have a Klingon wedding for themselves, this is a very small percentage of fans of Star Trek, for example. So, but Sharon, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to kind of explore a little bit the concept of the soul.
Yes.
The explanation of the soul in Christianity is wrapped and shrouded in myth.
Yes.
Your soul gets the reward for leading a so-called good Christian theological life, whatever that fits it.
Yes.
So the soul is all about the myth. It's
Yes.
all about a giant myth.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And that's what makes it so hard for somebody raised in an Apollonian culture to apply it to themselves. So they're like, well, what if, how do I talk about soul outside of the context of that myth? What else could it be except that version of soul? And what Hegel and Kierkegaard and Smith and others are getting at is that you can be a theist and be totally in touch with that version of what a soul is and still benefit from adding to it the deeper question of, well, what is the structure of the soul and how does it relate to things? Because then you think that's what's surviving rather than just that something is surviving. What you just said is right on. The idea that the behavior in your life accumulates in your soul and the soul is rewarded or punished. Heraclitus said much the same thing. In a roundabout Greek polytheistic way. He said, ethos anthropoi daimon, character is fate. And what he meant by that, and Hegel's, that's like throughout this, you almost can't, it's hard to read any sentence of Kenneth Smith or Hegel or Kierkegaard without holding that as one of the things you kind of have at hand. The idea is that as you act in the world, you're reinforcing certain innate tendencies of your own character, your soul. And as you do that, the soul evolves over time and becomes different, right? And so if as a Christian you practice discipline to treat people more generously, it actually gets easier to treat people more generously. If you never do that, and then at a moment of crisis, you suddenly need to be generous, you don't have the habit. You don't have, your character has not been bent in that direction and grown in that direction. It's like there was a shady area and no leaves developed on that tree. And so as a result, in the moment of crisis, you're less likely to be able to do the thing that you need to be able to do to be a good Christian under the circumstances. So what's happening is you have a feedback loop between the things that you're able to do and what you have done in the past and put into your soul. The things, the way that you've shaped your soul shapes you in turn. When he says ethos anthropoi daimon, I think I said this in one of the early sessions. He means that your character acts like a daimon, a divinity, a lower level divinity that rides on your back. When we say you've got a monkey on your back, we're talking about having a bad daimon. You're unfortunate. You have a mischievous idiot that's telling you what to do. And what Heraclitus is saying more generally is, you certainly have somebody on your back. You have your soul, your character is on your back. And it's determining what comes naturally to you. It's your nature. It's determining what comes naturally to you, what comes easy to you, and what's hard, what you have to struggle to overcome. So if you invest in cultivating your soul to do the kinds of things it needs to be able to do, then over time those things get easier. But if you neglect your soul, or worse, if you give in to bad habits that lead you towards vicious behavior, then in the future, you're going to be more likely to do those bad things. And so the Christians in the early Christianity, the first centuries BC, before they became their own sort of cut-off theology, Christianity was meant as a supplement to the ancient worldview because they were ancients, right? They all grew up immersed in the ancient worldview. They all knew all of this stuff and they took it for granted, but they didn't write all of it down in the New Testament. Because why would you write down things everybody knows? So there's a lot of sentences in Paul and in the Gospels that are meant to be read by somebody who already has this perspective in their mind about the nature of the soul and its relationship to character and habits and what you do and so on. So when a Christian says, when an early Christian puts down in writing and says that the soul is the part of you that survives and gets to go to heaven, the reason that it survives and gets to go to heaven is that you've lived a Christian life and cultivated the kind of soul that will survive. And you did it in the way that Heraclitus is talking about, because that's the way the Greeks understood soul to work. So what Hegel and Kierkegaard and others are doing here is unpacking, in some ways, from a Christian perspective, they're unpacking what Christians originally meant when they wrote those things down, rather than what we imagine we might mean if we're writing it down today and all we've had is the catechism of Sunday school and what we've heard from our preachers and what we read into the Bible from our perspective as moderns. It's like a different kind of Christianity. But it's not incompatible with the current one. It just has more depth to it. It's got more, there are fewer caricatures and there's more things sort of filled in with details that would have been the same details they were thinking about when they wrote this stuff down. Does that make sense? Do you have a question, Sharon? Oh, you're on mute.
The other thing that I'm thinking about is the myth around the soul also fed into the culture as a tool for control.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and that's part of why the modern version of the Christian notion of the soul is so different from the original version of the Christian soul.
Yes.
Is that after the early period of the Christian church, they went through that period of consolidation where they were trying to get rid of heresies and come down on a single conception of what Christianity would be. And as they did that, they were trying to get what had previously been sort of a fly your freak flag radical innovation, kind of version of Christianity where there were 1,000 varieties, each writing their own scriptures, to try to make it into a single religion. And that required getting people to spend a little less time coming up with their own ideas and a little more time learning the ideas that you wanted them to have. There was an orthodoxy period that kind of followed.
Also, it was political also.
Yeah. That was how they became the religion of the Roman Empire.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where I was going.
Yeah, I thought you might have been. And then to pull together into one coherent religion that was compatible with the imperial aims of Rome.
Yes.
And so some certain amount of editing had to take place. So soul and spirit, right? So at first it's uncomfortable to use these words other than the way that moderns understand them. But eventually we sort of see that it is both compatible with and sort of more interesting than the way we typically use it in the modern era. That soul has all of this stuff in it about being your personal nature. And they meant it that word, nature. They literally meant the nature that's outside of us that determines, when the rain falls and that rivers go downhill and all that. Each of us inside has a personal nature as well. And that's our soul, our character, a critical part of what we would think of when we say our mind is our nature.
Yeah.
And it's malleable over time if we can do the work. If we can engage our spirit enough to shape ourselves, then we can shape our character over time. But if we don't, if we just stay immersed in that nature and we don't exert our spirit, if we don't put our soul in motion deliberately, then we end up being symptoms of whatever we happen randomly to have been born with. And that's why in the late Greek period, they started focusing on astrology. It's like, could they predict what you were born with? Because if you had a good soul, eudaimonia, you were born with a good daimon, then you would have a lucky life because you'd want to do the right things that lead to success. But if you were unlucky, if you had dysdaimonia, you were born under a bad star, disaster, bad star, then you would have an unlucky life in which you kept being drawn to do the wrong things that made life worse for you and for other people. So they got obsessed with that. Could they predict which kind of soul you were born with? And they started to put less energy into, well, what about the spirit? What about cultivating yourself? What about trying to become a better person and to do more good in the world and shaping your soul? You could sort of, in Gilbert Murray's book, 5 Stages of Greek Religion, this is the 5th chapter, the 5th stage. And the title of the chapter is The Loss of Nerve. He says Greece went through a period where they had so many failures in a row that they sort of gave up. The whole project of we should try to strive to uplift ourselves to be better people, they sort of abandoned and just sort of fell into, I wish somebody would save us from ourselves because we're a mess. Look what we did. Civil war after civil war, and finally conquered by Macedonia. They're like, screw it. So it's interesting because the kind of savior that you look for when you have an activist relationship to your own soul, right? Someone to inspire you and guide you in helping you to do the work to become a better person. It's a very different kind of savior than you look for when you lose your nerve and give up on that struggle. And you say, look, it's not up to me whether I was born with a good soul or a bad soul. God did that, and I really just want someone to bail me out. Then you want a savior who's just going to rescue you. And then you're just looking for what's the minimum do I have to do in order to go to heaven? It's like a whole different religion, even though it's got the same name. And even though they both have a savior, the role of the savior is different.
Like the role of a hero.
Yeah. Yeah. Does Jesus save us entirely without any work on our part? Or does Jesus show us how to do the work to make ourselves savable? Right? Is the purpose of conversion to Christianity a get out of hell free card? Or is it so that you become a better person who treats other people better, who behaves in a Christian way so that you go to heaven as a result of that?
The theology of Christianity, as I see it, was really a tool for political control.
Right.
Right.
And that's number one.
Right.
And number two, that's the hard side. And number two, the soft side is whether or not Jesus saves you or whether you're going to go to heaven. All of that was the myth.
Right.
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 But number one, it was just a hard tool for political control.
Right.
So that's just a great example of what Ken Smith talks about, our logos culture sort of dominating and manipulating the old myths.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. Thank you. Right.
Trying to reduce it to an exchange, like a market exchange.
Yes.
Right.
The second concept of soul, though, and whether it's immortal and recyclable, is something that's always interested me about Hinduism.
Yes.
Because they have a different concept of the soul.
They do.
And I can't tell if the period of evolution of the Greeks was also the period evolution of the Hindus, different parts of the world.
Yeah.
Right? And whether or not they impacted, but the Hindus believe in karma, and what you do in your life depends on the kind of soul that comes back, the eudaimonia, the dysdaimonia, whatever you called it. But that's their basic belief.
Yes.
And Sharon, there's even, when you get into like reincarnation, even though we're not really saying it, there's an idea that you die and are reborn every second. And so are they talking about a life after death, or are they talking about life after life? Life after, the choices you make every second, you can make a different choice and they're impacted by what you're doing. And so if you're making poor choices, you have a hell on earth. And if you're making good choices, you can experience a heaven on earth. That type of a concept of an active reincarnation happening as we live, not this event that occurs once we die with finality type of thing. And that's
the dysdaimonia and the eudaimonia you're talking about, Rick.
Yeah. Yeah. So the things you're bringing up, Sharon, we're going to get to those in this series. Not today, because they're so big. But there's a reference to the Veil of Maya later in this.
Yes.
And when we hit the Veil of Maya, we're going to open up Buddhism and Hinduism and talk about their intersection with this.
Great.
And likewise, when he starts talking about the yin and yang and Tao, we're going to open that up and talk about it. And the reason we're going to do that is because there was interaction between these cultures. Part of the reason we know is that the Hindu religion goes way back. It goes back before the Greeks. It's the oldest continuous religion we know about.
That's my question. Yeah.
And it's just not possible to have so many people generating so much culture and interacting with people all over the world and not have ideas spread. Of course, they had to have spread. It had to be.
Isn't it funny? We came full circle to what we were talking about at the very beginning of our call, Rick.
Yeah.
That the ideas that these cultures propagate, and Heraclitus may not have been a real man, or was he, or wasn't he? Yeah. Interesting.
It's all tied up here.
I have a sort of a geographical question.
Shoot, Daddy.
So I always look at the Greeks as much more Asian, and then I don't know how much evidence is it, but so many of the Greeks mathematicians and philosophers basically trained in Egypt.
Yes.
And so why is there, perhaps there's a geographical plus historical, why is there such an association with the Greeks being the beginnings of Western society? Is it just because like that knowledge, or just because their skin is white? I don't know why can't we see the Greeks? I even see them now as basically Asian.
I have two answers.
Go ahead.
Two answers. So one is the idea that the Greeks are the seedbed of Western civilization was part of the Renaissance and Enlightenment.
Mm-hmm.
And the Renaissance and Enlightenment were strongly tied up with justifications for slavery because they rose at the same time. The exact same time people were bursting out of the church of the medieval era and saying, we're going to decide for ourselves, we're going to have these rules, and we're going to do science and all that, was the same time they started stealing people from Africa and also purging their own countries of the black people who had been living there for centuries or thousands of years and selling them into slavery. There's a undiscussed but massively conspicuous element of racism associated with the rise of the Enlightenment in Europe. For example, Queen Elizabeth, who everybody's heard of, and we all think we know things about her, but among the things that we don't know about her is that she was the one who got rid of all the black people who had been living in England for thousands of years. She rounded them up and sold them off. And they weren't slaves that somebody had left there accidentally. They weren't guests. They had been there since the beginning. There were black people in England before there were white people in England. We know from Cheddar Man, from the DNA in the fossil, that white people didn't get to England until long after dark-skinned people had already been there for thousands of years. It's white skin arose recently. It's a recent mutation. It's just a few thousand years BC is when white people spread west into Europe out of the Caucasus.
And is this separate from like what they call Moors?
They used to call them blackamoors.
Yes.
Shakespeare refers to the blackamoors. There's laws on the books that refer to the blackamoors. And what Queen Elizabeth did was round up all the blackamoors and enslave them and sell them off so that she could purify and advance England and make it an advanced power, because advanced powers are white, as we all know, because we're moderns, right? This is what we've been marinating in. So, and likewise, the Enlightenment and all these things were funded by the slave trade. I mean, a huge amount of wealth comes from destroying thousands of years of natural and cultural capital of an entire continent. Just an unbelievable scale of transfer of wealth. So it makes it, so what happened is when they were doing all that, they needed to create a mythology. They needed a way to think about, why are white people better than everybody else? Why do we deserve to enslave everybody else and take all their stuff? Why is that evolution? Even before Darwin, they were all working on, why. And this was a huge break from the past, because in the past, nobody cared what your skin color was. I mean, the whole idea that you'd talk about blackamoors in England or white-skinned people in England was absurd. They only cared what religion you were so that they could know, am I supposed to shoot you or am I supposed to join you? Or they wanted to know, what's your language you speak so I know whether I can talk to you. Or they had all these other concerns that was their entire focus. And they almost never talked about race unless it's, it's curious. That guy over there has white skin. Huh, how strange. It's like, as often as you might mention, did you know his hair was red? Huh, what a curiosity. It just was not an overriding concern until the Renaissance and the Enlightenment and the rise of a racial consciousness of Europe as a pure advanced place that deserved to dominate the world. Before that, it was very different. So in constructing the mythology, they needed a white foundation that they could lay underneath, which was where all the great things came from, and they decided to make it Greece. They couldn't make it Rome because, let's face it, some of those late Roman emperors were just humiliatingly bad and insane. It's like, so that can't be our foundation. That's horrible. They pick and choose a few of them, but they're like, let's go back further. How about the Greeks? Oh, look at all these Greeks. They're so smart. They do all these things. And then they drew a line and said, we will not look at whether the Greeks got those ideas from Babylon or whether they got them from Turkey or India or Egypt or Nubia. We're not going to talk about any of that stuff. This is the foundation. This is where it stops. It stops here with the people we can be sure are white. And the great irony of this is, actually, in hindsight, there's no certainty that they were white. I mean, a lot of them were white, but they weren't interested in race any more than we are. They were interested in tribes and religions and, which city-state were you from? Those things were the paramount concerns. And the fact that we assume they're white is because we look at the statues of which all the pigments have eroded off and say, look, it's a white statue. It must have been white people. But as we go back and look more deeply, what we discover is, okay, the statues were painted, and lots of the statues were white people, but not all of them. And some of the heroes in the Greek myths were, in fact, said in the myth to be African or to be from Asia or what have you. There were multiple races involved in Egypt. In Greece. It's just in hindsight that we make them white, and so that we can make them as part of our story of of white supremacy, which hopefully we're coming out of. The other answer, which is much shorter, is that you're right to look at kind of the idea of the Greeks as not necessarily being a European phenomena, because even though they were in Europe, they were a trader culture. They were all about interchange with cultures all over the Mediterranean, and also, you know, east, west, north, south, wherever they could reach. The trade network was the engine of Greek civilization. And if you look at where the predominance of human beings that called themselves Hellenes actually were, an enormous number of them were on Asia Minor, on the coast. That's where Heraclitus was. That's where Parmenides was, right? All these daughter colonies of the original cities had enormous percentages of the population, even in Egypt, North Africa, right? So they were a multi-continental phenomenon, and as a result, they were drawing from all kinds of different cultures. They were not strictly a European phenomena, despite the way that we talk about them. Richard, you got your hand up?
Yeah, like you're talking about, like, you know, why Rome isn't thought of as, you know, like the kind of the seat of Western, you know, especially Anglo kind of culture. Like, I was recently watching this documentary series on the Smithsonian Channel, and probably, you know, co-produced with BBC or something. But the host is a British historian, and it's interesting to see sort of like Britain as, you know, a former empire, but still not fully over the fact that you know, they're this powerful empire, and like,
yeah,
and can kind of see that perspective, like, you know, like admiring like another empire. But I think, like, also, like, you know, maybe like you know, in terms of like England and Rome, like, you know, so like the story of Boudicca's revolt, you know, and I think, like, you know, I'm guessing that probably, you know, has to, like, you know, would square in terms of like not wanting to draw the lineage, you know, back to like Roman Empire.
Yeah.
But I also thought it was very kind of telling that, like, you know, like they would kind of criticize, you know, like these Roman ideas and, you know, their brutality and such, without any kind of like self-aware irony of Britain's own, you know, brutality. You know, like a lot of it was kind of
track record.
Yeah, a lot of it was kind of behind this kind of bureaucratic, you know, like mechanism of doing things, right?
Yes.
But like it's very telling, yeah. So
I don't, you know, Calvin and Hobbes. Bill Watterson has these great styles to the way that he does his comics, and one of the ones that I've come to admire more and more is the way when one of the characters shifts out of directly interacting with the world around them and instead starts piously narrating some memorized bit of catechism, they close their eyes. They have this bit where their eyes are closed and they're looking all beatific while they say this truism that actually none of them believes, but they're pretending to believe it for a moment. You know, he does that all the time as the butt of a joke or to set up a joke. It's a clever thing he does because it's something we do so often. Right. So you see it with the way people will talk about what a noble guy Thomas Jefferson was, because look at these noble words that he put in the Declaration of Independence. At the exact same time, he had people imprisoned for life to work for him, right? It's like he's saying all people are created equal. At the exact same time, he has people enslaved. Yeah. It's like he clearly is a hypocrite. Clearly is a hypocrite, but we sort of piously agree to only think about one part of the story or the other and not put the both together. It's like there are times where we're willing to say, oh, yes, you know, it's unfortunate. Did you know he also had slaves? Yes. But then we put that back on the shelf, and then we pull off the other picture of Jefferson off the shelf in which, oh, my God, this enlightened guy who was all in favor of all these progressive things. We don't combine them. And if we combine the concrete reality with the abstract ideals, we get a far more interesting view of the world and ourselves and nature than if we take one of them in isolation.
Like, I think in this essay, like Kenneth Smith like describes kind of like the use of the metaphor of like deodorant and how we just kind of mask
yes.
it.
Anesthetic, right. He says.
Yeah. And like sort of one of the most horrific times, like this host, she expresses her kind of disgust at, and she realizes she's interpreting through like a modern frame in terms of like the like gladiators and like and like killing animals like during the Great Games and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But like it's like Boudica, she's like describing like her campaign, like sweeping like both Romans as well as those who did not join her side, like, and it's basically just like a scorched earth. Like it's horrific. Like one description is like she was known to have cut the breasts off women and sewn them into their mouths. It's like this is like a war criminal. It's like like they're lionized as like this symbol of British patriotism and and independence and Britannia, like so it's
it's funny. I mean, you see the way that when the British were trying to do their ultra nationalist myths, it has to be in quotes because these aren't real myths, but when they were trying to come up with these stories that they could make themselves feel proud about, they were indecisive about what they should be tracing back to. So you've got the ones who are saying, well, it's the proud Norman stock, that's what it is. And others who are saying, no, the Normans were shit. It was the Anglo-Saxons that were great, and Robin Hood and fight the Normans. And then others are going, no. It's totally the original, British revolt against the not the Anglo-Saxons, but the Brits, and their revolt against the Romans. That's where our greatness was. And others go, no, it's the Roman Empire, and we're going to be an empire too. And that incoherency, that ability to that uncertainty about who they really are, that they're not willing to take the whole picture of all the things that they're doing and try to come up with a mythic whole that accounts for it. What they're doing is abstracting and picking pieces here and there that for their current mood fits and exalts what they see from that mood. But then later in another mood or another person looking at the same thing, it doesn't satisfy them. They get imposter syndrome. They're like, that's not me. I'm this other thing. So what you're seeing there is the inability of them to figure out who they are and where they are and what they stand for and what they've done and deal with it all honestly. This is one of the key differences between true mythos and false mythos, is that true mythos, if we look at Hegel's Geist here in this diagram, you wouldn't necessarily be clear from what we've read so far that mythos and logos don't just correspond to Begriff and Verstand. Right? Mythos is a whole zone of things, and logos is a whole zone of things.
Yeah.
Right.
And real myth, in the way that Kenneth Smith means it, is an heuristic phenomena. It's a philosophical phenomena that has to incorporate both the Begriff and the Verstand. It has to be sweeping in its scope, like Verstand, but also concretely natural and true and real. Because if all it is hollow ideals, it's not really a myth.
But doesn't Kenneth Smith make the point that, and I can't find it in this essay, that the mythos culture is almost resistant to any self-examination?
This is where the blurriness comes in some of these essays. Sometimes he does a drive-by reference to something where he didn't come back and tune it up.
Yes.
So this is part of why I thought we'd do some diagrams. This would be helpful. So, he definitely buys the Begriff Verstand philosophy dynamic out of Hegel's concept of Geist. And he's definitely aligning his own system with this system and showing how they're related to each other. So from the perspective of a modern, we've been shoved all the way over into this extreme Verstand form of culture, which everything is formalized like a great machine. And when you watch the way people go about law giving, it's clear that whatever they may say they think, if you judge them by their actions, they believe that it's possible with enough of the right laws to create a perfect society. We can all just be mechanized into being little automatons of the law who do the things we're supposed to do and not the things we're supposed to do. And that even the criminals will each have their own category of what kind of criminal they are and how the law engages with them and changes them by moving them into prison or what have you until they're rehabilitated and go back into the structure. So it's to create of the cosmos of human beings a world machine. And it's based on the premise that all of nature is also a world machine. And if there's a God anywhere in this stuff, it's a founding father style deist God who set the great clockwork mechanism in motion and then doesn't intervene. You can tell. just from the structure of the law and the structure of politics and the structure of the economy, that's the underlying view of what it means to be human or alive or natural. That's the conception. It's sort of the anti-myth underneath it all. And the problem is all of that is so distant from our real experience of life that it can't be satisfying. This is the horrific dilemma that we're stuck in as moderns, is that we have created a perfectly crafted artificial conception of ourselves and the world that is not ultimately satisfying and leaves us starving for a Verstand that instead of being a master has been made a servant and turned into a composite with nature to give our actual circumstances meaning instead of to pretend our actual circumstances aren't actually happening, which is what it actually does.
Why in his previous essay he was talking about our freedom that we think we have as moderns, but it's really just another form of slavery that we've created for ourselves.
Yes, exactly.
So can I just read this one sentence here?
Please.
That I think it said, in an evaluative sense, moderns know nothing of what is essential in themselves. They are merely skeletonized personalities that need to be manipulated by energies outside themselves.
Yes.
Is that what you're saying, I think?
That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, and as the more you read Kenneth, the more you're going to build up this vocabulary of key terms that when you see that term, you stop. And sometimes he helps you by italicizing it, like the word essential.
Yes.
Essence is a critical Greek idea and philosophical idea and Kenneth Smith idea. And when by essence, he doesn't mean the Platonic essence, which is the opposite of essence. He doesn't mean that you essentially are a reflection of this perfect, pure form somewhere in some world of forms of which we are all just reflections or shadows. He means the opposite of that. He means the original Greek idea that your essence is very close to your soul or your character. It's what you innately are. It takes into account if you're pregnant with your future selves, and if you're aliotically becoming some other, all of that potential that's inside you is part of your essence. It's who you essentially are. And if we try to describe you in ways that either ignore or contradict what's actually in you, then our description of the world is violating the essential truth. It might be capturing aspectival truth, but it's missed the essential truth.
And I like that next sentence about the market there, and that next paragraph about how it goes on to say that the market doesn't just meet their needs, but even more profoundly defines what those needs are.
Yes. That's the thing that people who are complete advocates of the market don't want to admit to.
Right.
Are we actually meeting your needs, or are we reprogramming you to want the things that we have on offer?
It's not rational.
Right.
That's the whole field of like behavioral economics.
Right.
Yes.
And nudge theory.
Yes.
That's Amos and Tversky and their prospect theory I was talking about.
And Dick Thaler. Yeah, Richard Thaler as well, yeah.
And it's dangerous stuff, because the entire value proposition of modernism and the modern market is that it meets human needs. But if it's reprogramming human beings to crave things that they don't need, or worse, that are bad for them, then we have an inverted value proposition. Suddenly, instead of creating a kind of heaven on earth of satisfying people's needs, we're creating a hell on earth of making people's needs worse, of making their situation worse.
That's just further elucidates that concept, the inversion between freedom and slavery, right? We think that the market provides for all of our needs, but really it's made us a slave to the needs that it has defined. So rather than freeing us, it has enslaved us.
Yes. And this is where Marx's anti-Marxist comment that the ruling class is not satisfied either. They are also not living an actualized life. They are not getting what they need either. The system encompasses them as well as everybody else. And in being freed and cut off from labor, they're also freed and cut off from creativity and productivity and the sense of being a participant in the world and knowing who you are and knowing that you did good for people. And instead you're stuck with, I have a whole bunch of profit that I got at the expense of other people, but I never actually did anything with my life, which is a common complaint you hear from very rich people on their deathbed, which is like, well, this was all great, but actually I've felt empty for the last 40 years.
And like for much of their lives, their only, like a lot of times, like their only way like they find meaning is basically to be in competition with other ultra wealthy people.
Yes.
And that's like how, you know, like to move up the Forbes list, or, you know,
Yes.
like or like, yeah. So
because in a culture devoid of myth, there
Yes.
is no meaning there. So
Yes.
they've been taught this is the meaning. The meaning
Right.
is to have more, to have a bigger number, and that's why they do that. You know.
Well, it's based on not being content. So then the myth itself is the idea of this market that it's ultimately that's becomes your god. So to
Yes.
speak.
Yes.
So that this is where your belief systems are kind of falling into the same lines of the myths, and so it's a very hard thing to answer, even if with the idea of nudge and things along those lines really do help shift the way we think about the market.
Yes.
In general, and that's the contribution that Tversky and Kahneman have given us is a different way to actually think about the market itself. And we even go back to the idea when we were talking about money before as the value system per se. It does have a certain role to send signals of shortages of things, but now it's the perverted role. It becomes the only thing.
Right.
And that perversion is actually what perverts everybody's behavior.
Right.
So because then everybody values that, and then they don't value each other, and they see each other as competition. And so that discontent is what fuels. That's a cycle of discontent that is fueled within that process.
There's some. Go ahead.
Sorry, Rick. Go ahead, Rick.
Oh, you first.
It should have been our servant, and it has become our master.
Yes.
Exactly.
If you are content, there's nothing more to sell to you. I mean, most modern advertising seeks to create a discontent in you.
Yes.
You lack something. The looks, the friends, the whatever it is, you're missing it, and you can buy it from us, and that will give you meaning, supposedly.
That's right.
So that's...
I wouldn't even say advertising creates this discontent. The discontent is there. The advertising is just speaking to it.
Right.
Yeah.
I tend to think that it has an I think it co-creates the discontent.
Like a feedback loop.
Yes, like a feedback loop. It amplifies it. But also, Richard, I am sympathetic to that view. If it didn't exist in the first place, I don't think they could just create it. So
it's got something to draw on. So, part of what's interesting here is that this problem of the upper crust of the bourgeoisie climbing the social ladder only to find nothing at the top worth having is a direct result. We remember an early session when we talked about the three epochs and how they arranged God, man, and nature. And that in the ancient world, nature was the highest authority, and the gods, in the polytheistic sense, were aspects of nature that had authority over us. They weren't all-encompassing creator gods the way that the Hebrew God was. They were telling us the things we have to pay attention to remain sane and healthy and sustainable. And then under that was humanity. Humanity was surrounded by these powers of the divinities and nature, and that was what gave us an upward drive. We could say, well, we are what we are, but look at what Athena is, or look at the amazing harmony in this forest and the things that live in it sustainably. We could aspire to do more than what we are now because these things are above us. So when the Christian Revolution happened, it dethroned nature. And that was part of the process of orthodoxy, was the shift from a version in which God was in nature like the other gods were, to a version in which nature was dethroned. Now God was on top. People were underneath God, and their only direction was towards the one set of commands, the one divinity, the one rules. It became a simplifying great arrow. People should do this one thing. And nature was dethroned as a source of no meaning at all. It was instead turned into, it's just something that God made, but don't lose sight of what God's telling you to do. Don't look away from God to see the world around you and think that there's any guidance there at all. There's not. It's just a creed.
That's so fascinating. Now you could see why they were so intent on expurging some of the paganistic influences out of Catholicism, because they elevated nature.
Yes,
Yeah.
they wanted to get rid of anything that reeked of the old world by putting nature ahead. But by doing that, it was ultimately a totalitarian, nihilizing thing to do, which is why the Orthodox version of Christianity was so different from the early version. The early version had God and nature and man still bound up together, but the subsequent version sort of unhomed man from nature. And now our only allegiance was to God. And nature, if anything, was a temptation to hell, to lead us away from the things that we were supposed to do. It sort of absolutized this notion that people are all sinners equally. It's not that some people behave better than others and that we should behave like the better ones and that all of us should behave more like Jesus. It became like, no, you all suck and you all need salvation. So,
Original
there's
sin.
God and then there's nothing. There's a great evacuation of meaning from the cosmos. And that set up the modern order. Because when the modern order overthrew God and put man on top, now there was nothing above man. And this is a disastrous cultural condition or psychological condition for a human being to be in, because if we don't have something drawing us upwards, all we're left with is all the stuff that draws us downwards, our worst habits, our vices, feeding our appetites, even at the cost of each other or the sustainability of the species or the world around us. So we basically decapitated our moral direction and left ourselves with nothing to aspire to.
And if you put man at the top of the pyramid, then you can put a man there, and it becomes atomizing and drifts into that hyper logos culture that Kenneth Smith talks about.
Back to might makes right, which is fascinating because almost the exact same drives, when they were in their original context they were meant to be in before this set of revolutions began, that exact same context suddenly has new context that makes it impossible for anyone to claim I'm the top of the pyramid. Well, no, you aren't. There's all these divinities, and then there's nature, and all of it teaches us that no one person gets to live forever. No one person gets to be in charge of everybody else. No one is infinitely wise. But once we lose all our context, we're just left with human ego as our guide. And it causes, it's why ultra-Apollonianism erupted the way that it did in the modern era, is that the naturalistic essentialist controls that used to be there were stripped away. So this is why I brought this up, is this, anytime we talk about essentiality, we're talking about nature, and we're talking about the soul and human character, because that's the nature inside of us that determines what we're going to find easy or difficult. And then in turn, we're talking about nature, we're talking about authority and sources of meaning. All of these things go together in a little graph of structure around human psychology and culture. And this is when you talk about Kenneth Smith being scintillating, this is part of the reason why is he's taking what in modernism we're taught are a bunch of unrelated, disconnected ideas, and showing how not only are they all connected to each other, but in a way that's as important as our heartbeat. It's essential to being sane. We can't be sane without all this stuff.
Which is consistent with his ethos of unifying through myth, right?
Yes.
It's just wonderful.
And so that's where we start to get the difference in definition between myth in the ancient sense and myth in the modern sense. Myth in the modern sense is any organizing story, even if it's a lie, or even if it's a hollow truth that doesn't get to the essence of things. Whereas there is an actual myth that we need, a function, a role, which is a way to pull together the Begriff mind and the Verstand mind into a world of meaning that allows us to be immersed in the world and in ourselves while never feeling lost and always feeling like we belong. That earlier essay he wrote that ended on the sentence, "It was the last time that human beings truly felt at home in the world at the dawn of civilization." You remember that line? This is what he's talking about. That was the job of mythos, is to make us feel at home, know why we're here and what we're supposed to do, without giving us the specific answer, just giving us the framework that we could be sane and productive in.
That's so key. It's an answer without being the answer. And that is just so key to his line of thinking. It's really magnificent.
So this is one of the places, going back to soul and spirit and the sentence that we were on. This is one of the ways in which I say I'm a student rather than a teacher, and my explanations aren't going to be quite precise enough. One of the ways that you can see that is, it's possible that aligning spirit with Verstand is a mistake. It's possible that what spirit should be aligned with is the eros. That spirit is the soul in motion, but in motion to where? It could be in motion to different places. Maybe from Begriff to Verstand is every bit as much spirit as the arrow back upward to philosophy. And then when philosophy generates its own antithesis, those arrows going from there to the subsequent thesis are also spirit. That soul is the tendency to be one of these things, to be in one of these modes, to have an identity and think a certain way and feel a certain way. And that spirit is that learning to dislocate the joint of the mind and push, get some leverage and push on the soul to cultivate it and get it to change.
Yeah, I think that spirit encapsulates both soul and will. That would be sort of the dichotomy I would use just myself.
Yeah. So this goes, I'm, sorry, Sharon's not here, but I'm basically agreeing with you and her and saying it might be that it's more productive to think about Verstand less as spirit and more as will. And certainly will and intellect. Will, let's say will in its intellectual rationalist mode. Yes. And then Begriff might be will in its emotionalist driven immersive mode.
Right. What makes it so hard to use these dichotomies is because of yin yang. There's always one in the other. So the limitations of our language, we're really up against the limitations here.
That's right. That's right. So I'm wondering whether I ought to save this for next time. Maybe I should save it because we're coming up on the end of hour 3. Only a little bit more to go. Yeah, we'll save this for next time. But you can see what we're building towards here is we can use Hegel to critique Kierkegaard and say Kierkegaard's version of this dichotomy sort of oversimplifies the erotic mode in order to make it fit in his sort of journey towards Christianity. And it leaves out some things that are essential. Right. So Kierkegaard was a keen critic of the modernist forms of Christianity, but he was also a modern Christian. And so as he attempted to critique it, some things he could see in relief clearly and draw contrast between, and some things he couldn't because he was that too much. He was too in it to quite see where it was going. And one of the main ways you can see this is that the Greek or Hegelian or Nietzschean or Smithian approach to the relationship between these things is that you don't get to the next level above the aesthetic by leaving the erotic behind. The erotic isn't our bestial animal nature that we must escape. It's not that simple. That's a Christian, and I mean in the medievalist sense. That's a medievalist Christian conception, that the animal is bad, okay, because nature is down there, and then we must rise up through the human towards the divine. The naturalist Greek sense is that the idea that you would escape your nature is absurd. What you need to do is integrate your nature into your intellect and will together into a whole. And so as a result, the journey from the erotic to the poetic gets you away from nature and towards an abstracted, self-abstracted conception of yourself. But then to move beyond that, you have to put the pieces together in a new way that you get your nature back, but in a way that's understood, that you're capable of moving as a spirit and not being stuck in as just a soul. And that was not a Kierkegaardian concept. Kierkegaard's concept is then you get further away into the ethical, and then you get further away into the religious as you escape yourself into God. He had a transcendentalist picture of meaning and nature, whereas Hegel and especially the Greeks are more immanentalist, in which the meaning is in nature and not to be found somewhere else.
That's so interesting. That's why the Greeks, all their gods still have their foibles, even though they're gods, right?
Yes.
Because they can't detach fully from that.
Yeah. And I think Ares is the great example of that. Because, war obviously has power over us, but they were very happy to show Ares doing idiotic things because of the stupid side of war. The Romans didn't care for that because they were unbalanced. They wanted, as they shifted into becoming more of an imperial power, but even during the Republic, they worshipped Mars more. Julius Caesar returning to Rome had himself decked out as Mars. Mars here, Mars there, Mars everywhere. Mars is great. So they really didn't care to see Mars made a fool of the way that the Greeks like to make Ares be seen as a fool, because they're like, oh, are you saying that we're foolish? That would be bad. We're very serious people and you should be afraid of us. Look at my pointy sword. So yes, as you say, the foibles, the naturalist side. All right, well, we'll come back to this. So we won't normally take an entire 3 hours to go through one sentence. that's not the mode that that we're going to be doing. But there's just so much in that opening sentence, and also kind of there's a sense of, I feel like we had a visual deficit. We've been doing text for so long and discussion for so long. We don't have any pictures to try to make sense out of all these different dimensions that we're trying to relate to each other. When I described last week 5 different levels of what he means by, Verstanden Begriff, Banauseia, and Dulea, that was an awful lot to try to visualize without a picture. So I'm slowing down in this opening paragraph just long enough to catch up with some of the pictures of what is the relationship between gnosis and doulos and pathos, or between noesis and benausos and logos and so forth. And we'll dig into that more next time. And then armed with that, we'll be able to move ahead faster. Not as fast as we did in previous weeks, but faster through the rest of this essay. All the chewy stuff. And we'll bring in Hannah Arendt and Nietzsche and everybody. Questions, comments, or concerns before we wrap up?
Wonderful as usual. Thank you. And see everyone next week.
Have a great week, Dave.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Yeah, well, that was great. Sorry I don't have a camera, but...
That's all right. So yeah, this essay, I think we could do a number of weeks on this one.
Yeah, so do I just roll over the blurb to next week, or do you want to write a new?
I can write a new blurb, but it's not going to take me long.
Okay, in that case, yeah. All right, that's fine.
I should hopefully have it by tonight. I'll
just roll over the same picture.
Yeah. That's right. We'll do part 2 of Mythic Desperation. Because this stuff gets really interesting when we start to pull Hannah Arendt into it, which I think we'll do next week.
All right.
Because that's where her 3 different realms of the economy and the 3 kind of modes of human life that are associated with the economy, where they map onto the Begriff, Verstand, and philosophy, and the erotic and the poetic, and Apollonian and Dionysian. It all sort of, Kenneth's clearly building a structure of relationships between the self, a thought, how you think, the mind, our tendencies, our personalities, the things we do in the world, our cultures, forms of civilization, forms of epochs. He's weaving it all together into a kind of coherent whole. And I think this essay gets it. I think it benefits a lot from being informed by that. I think we're ready. I think we've done enough of these sessions. We're ready to just lay it out and say, here's the outline. Now read it with this in mind. It looks different, right?
Well, that's great. Yeah, I mean, we're still getting new people, though. I mean, Richard is only here second week, so
yeah, this was good.
Yeah.
So okay, yeah, let's wrap up, and I'll catch you next Monday.
All right, send me the blurb, and we'll get it on the calendar.
Yay.
Okay. Bye, Rick.
Bye, David.